Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time now. What happened to me and my family back in May of 1894 still haunts me, and I've never been able to make proper sense of it. But after seeing others post their experiences here, I figured maybe someone might have answers, or at least know I'm not crazy. I was born and raised in Washington County, Kentucky, where my family owned a modest farm near Deep Creek. We weren't rich by any means, but we managed well enough with our livestock and crops. My father, Frederick, and my younger brothers, Thomas and James, worked the land alongside me. I was 23 at the time of the incident. The trouble started months before we actually saw the thing. At first, it was just small annoyances, a few eggs missing from the hen house, some vegetables pulled from the garden. Pa thought it might be foxes, or maybe some hungry drifter passing through. But as winter gave way to spring, things got worse. In March, we lost 2 lambs, not killed where they stood, completely gone, like something had carried them off. A week later, the Millers down the road lost a young pig. Clean disappearance, no blood, no struggle, just gone. Everyone was confused because normal predators leave evidence. Wolves tear things apart, bears make a mess. Whatever was taking our animals was careful, deliberate. Word started getting around the county about similar thefts. Most folks blamed each other at first. Times were hard, and stealing food wasn't unheard of. But then John Ewald, an old-timer who lived by himself near the creek, came into town, shaking and pale as a ghost one morning. I wasn't there when he told his story at Miller's General Store, but my pa was. John claimed he'd seen some kind of man-beast while checking his traps at dawn. Said it had long, coarse hair hanging from its head and face that looked like horsehair. Its legs were covered with the same hair, and around its waist it wore what he described as a piece of sheepskin that hung down to its knees. Most folks laughed it off. John was known to enjoy his whiskey more than most. But what scared people was how he described its eyes and mouth. He said they gave off a strange light, like they were glowing from the inside. When John tried to approach it, the thing ran off on 2 legs, but moved all wrong, according to him. Too fast, too fluid for a man. Pa came home troubled that day. He didn't share John's story with us right away. Probably didn't want to frighten my mother. But he started keeping his rifle closer at hand, and I noticed him watching the tree line more carefully at dusk. Other sightings followed. The widow Harmon said something peered in her window one night, something tall with a face not quite human. The Schmidt boys claimed they saw it drinking from the creek, hunched over on all 4s before standing upright when it noticed them. People started forming hunting parties, though nobody really knew what they were hunting. Some called it a wild man, others a devil or forest spirit. The local paper even printed a small story about the Deep Creek monster that had some of the city folks making jokes. We weren't laughing. The morning it came to our farm started like any other. May 15th, I remember it exactly. I was up before sunrise to milk our cows. The air was cool but promised heat later. Typical late spring weather. Everything seemed peaceful until I heard our dogs barking frantically by the barn. Our 2 hounds, Tucker and Blue, were reliable guardians. They'd bark at strangers or the occasional fox, but this was different. High-pitched, almost panicked. I grabbed Pa's old shotgun from beside the door, we'd taken to keeping weapons handy, and headed toward the commotion. I rounded the corner of our house just in time to see my father and Thomas already running toward the barn, rifles in hand. That's when I saw it. God help me. Even now I struggle to describe what I saw. It stood by our barn door, at least 6.5 feet tall. In the half-light of dawn, its body looked wrong, too lean, too angular to be human, but definitely standing on 2 legs. The hair covering its body wasn't like fur exactly, more like long, matted strands hanging from its limbs and head. The sheepskin John had described was there, wrapped around its waist, stained and filthy. But what froze my blood were its hands. They weren't hands at all, more like a cat's paws, but larger, with visible claws that gleamed even in the dim light. Its feet were similar, clawed and bent strangely, like it was walking on the balls of its feet. And John had been right about the eyes. They caught the first rays of sunrise and reflected it back like a lantern. Not animal eyeshine, something different, something that seemed to pulse with its own light. It was holding 3 of our chickens, already dead, clutched against its chest. When it saw us, it didn't immediately run. It watched us, head tilting slightly like it was curious. Then it made a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a growl, not quite a word, but something in between that made the hair on my neck stand up. "Don't move," Pa whispered, raising his rifle slowly. Thomas, always the hothead, didn't wait. He fired first, the crack of his rifle shattering the morning quiet. The creature jerked, but didn't fall. Instead, it dropped the chickens and moved, and Lord, how it moved. Not running like a man or an animal, but a horrible in-between gait, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes using its arms to propel itself forward with frightening speed. We all fired then, the shots echoing across our property. I'm certain Thomas hit it. I saw something dark spray from its shoulder, but it didn't slow down. It headed straight for the woods that bordered our eastern pasture, toward the hills where Deep Creek cut through the limestone. "We're going after it," Pa declared, already reloading. "James, tell your mother what's happened and stay with her." My youngest brother, only 15 then, looked relieved to be given that task. I saw fear in his eyes that mirrored my own, but Pa and Thomas were already heading toward the tree line, and I couldn't let them go alone. We tracked it through the woods, following broken branches and occasional dark droplets that confirmed Thomas had indeed hit it. The trail led directly toward the hills, specifically to a limestone outcropping that local kids sometimes explored. There was a cave there, not large, but deep enough that nobody had ever found its end. When we arrived at the cave entrance, we found disturbing evidence that the creature had been using it as a den. Scattered around the opening were feathers, small bones, and tufts of wool that likely came from missing lambs. What turned my stomach was the smell, a musky, rotten odor that reminded me of a predator's den, but mixed with something else, something almost human. "It's in there," Thomas whispered, pointing to fresh blood smeared on the rocks near the entrance. Pa nodded grimly. "We need more men, and lights." We weren't about to enter a dark cave after an injured creature we couldn't identify. We marked the location and headed back to gather neighbors. Within 2 hours, we'd assembled a group of 12 men from nearby farms, all armed, many looking skeptical despite having heard the stories for months. The Millers brought lanterns, and old Mr. Prescott even brought his hunting dogs, though the animals whined and resisted approaching the cave. "I ain't never seen Blue act like this," Hank Miller said as his normally brave hound tucked its tail between its legs. "Something ain't right here." Pa was the first to approach the entrance, rifle ready. "Hello in there," he called, his voice echoing slightly. "Come out now." Nothing but silence answered him. "We're going in," he decided. "Thomas, you and Samuel hang back with 4 others to guard the entrance in case it tries to slip past us. The rest come with me." I wanted to object. Every instinct told me entering that cave was a terrible idea, but I couldn't speak up in front of everyone. Instead, I found myself holding a lantern, following Pa and 4 neighbors into the darkness. The cave narrowed quickly after the entrance, forcing us to proceed in single file. The limestone walls glistened with moisture, and the floor was uneven, making each step treacherous. About 50 feet in, the passage opened to a small chamber where we could stand upright again. What we found there still appears in my nightmares. The chamber had been transformed into a grotesque living space. Bones of animals, Some recognizable as chickens and lambs, others too mangled to identify, were piled in one corner. Feathers, fur, and dried grass formed a large nest-like bed. But what disturbed us most were the items that suggested something beyond animal intelligence. Torn pieces of clothing that appeared to have been stolen from washing lines hung from rock protrusions, crude tools made from sharpened bone, and most disturbingly, a collection of small, shiny objects, buttons, a pocket watch, coins, and what looked like a child's metal toy soldier, arranged in a deliberate pattern. "God Almighty!" whispered Reverend Collins, who had insisted on joining us. "What manner of creature makes a home like this?" That's when we heard it, a low, rhythmic sound from deeper in the cave, not quite breathing, not quite growling. It reminded me of someone trying to form words without knowing how. Pa raised his lantern higher. "There's another passage back there." Indeed, at the rear of the chamber, a dark opening led deeper into the earth. The strange sounds were coming from there. We approached cautiously, weapons ready. The new passage was narrower than the first, forcing us to crouch. Pa led, with me right behind him, lantern held high. We'd gone perhaps 20 feet when Pa suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I heard nothing at first, then realized the rhythmic sound had stopped. Complete silence filled the cave, not even the dripping water that had accompanied us earlier. Then it came, a sound so unearthly that even now, decades later, I struggle to describe it. A high-pitched yelp that transformed into something like laughter, echoing from somewhere deep within the passage ahead of us. It wasn't the sound of any animal I've ever heard, nor was it human. It was both and neither, and it carried such malevolence that I felt it like a physical blow. Pa stumbled backward, nearly knocking me over. "Out!" he gasped. "Everyone out now!" We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled back through the passage, dignity forgotten, pure survival instinct taking over. I dropped the lantern in our rush, plunging us into darkness for terrifying seconds before we reached the first chamber where the other lights still burned. Behind us, that awful sound continued, now mixed with what sounded like movement. Scraping, scratching, coming closer. We burst from the cave entrance into the daylight, gasping and pale. The men who'd stayed outside looked at us in alarm. "What happened?" Thomas demanded. "What did you see?" "We're sealing this cave," Pa declared, his voice shaking slightly. "Now, today." Some men wanted explanations, but something in Pa's expression silenced them. We gathered fallen logs, branches, and rocks, working frantically to build a barricade across the cave entrance. As we worked, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see glowing eyes emerging from the darkness. We never saw the creature directly again that day, but twice, while building our barricade, we heard that chilling sound from deep within the cave. Several men crossed themselves, others whispered prayers. When we finished, Reverend Collins insisted on saying a blessing over the sealed entrance. Nobody objected. By late afternoon, we had blocked the cave with everything we could move, leaving just small gaps where sunlight could penetrate. "What now?" Thomas asked as we prepared to leave. "We come back tomorrow with dynamite," announced Miller, who worked occasionally with the railroad. "Seal it properly." Everyone agreed. But something told me it wouldn't be that simple. That night, none of us slept well. Ma kept the lamps burning until dawn, jumping at every creak of our old farmhouse. James asked repeatedly about what we'd seen in the cave, but Pa wouldn't elaborate, just saying it was unnatural and telling him not to worry, that it was trapped now. The next morning, 6 of us returned with 2 sticks of dynamite Miller had somehow procured. But when we reached the cave, we found our barricade partially dismantled, logs thrown aside, rocks rolled away. Not completely cleared, but enough to create a passage. "It got out," Thomas stated the obvious, his voice hollow. We approached cautiously, rifles ready. Miller suggested we still use the dynamite, seal the cave permanently to prevent it from returning to its den. As they discussed this, I noticed something scratched into the limestone beside the entrance. something that hadn't been there the day before. It wasn't random marks. They were crude but deliberate symbols, arranged in what looked almost like writing, though not in any language I recognized. 5 distinct symbols, carved deeply into the rock face with what must have been significant strength and sharp claws. I called the others over, and we all stared in silence. "What does it mean?" someone finally asked. Nobody answered. Nobody could. We did use the dynamite that day, collapsing the cave entrance completely. For weeks afterward, groups of armed men patrolled the area, and no livestock was taken during that time. Gradually, the patrols decreased as spring turned to summer, and no further sightings occurred. But the story doesn't end there. 3 weeks after the cave incident, I was returning home late from Springfield, where I'd gone to sell some tools. It was nearly midnight, the road lit only by my lantern and the quarter moon overhead. As I crossed the small bridge over Deep Creek, about a mile from our farm, I had the unshakable feeling I was being watched. I stopped my wagon, listening. The usual night sounds, crickets, frogs by the creek, had gone silent. Complete stillness surrounded me. Then I saw it, standing motionless among the trees, about 30 yards from the road. Even in the dim light, I could make out its tall, angular silhouette. It wasn't hiding. It was watching me deliberately. Those same eyes catching what little moonlight there was and reflecting it back with that unnatural glow. My horse sensed it too, stamping nervously. I should have whipped the reins and galloped away, but something held me there. A horrible fascination, perhaps, or simply paralyzing fear. For what seemed like minutes, but was probably only seconds, we stared at each other across that distance. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised one clawed hand and made a gesture, not threatening but deliberate, almost like it was pointing first at me, then toward the hills where we'd sealed its cave. Then it turned and moved into the deeper woods, that strange gait carrying it quickly into darkness. I finally broke free from my trance and raced home, the horse needing no encouragement. I told Pa what I'd seen, and for 3 nights we took turns keeping watch. But the creature never approached our farm. Over that summer, farms further from Deep Creek occasionally reported missing livestock, but nothing near us. It was as if the creature had moved its hunting grounds away from those who had discovered it. By fall, the incidents had mostly stopped, and life in Washington County slowly returned to normal. I've never shared the full story outside my family until now. Over the years, I've researched similar sightings, read books about wild men and forest creatures from folklore around the world. Nothing quite matches what we encountered. Sometimes I wonder if sealing that cave was the right decision. Whatever that thing was, it had created a home there, collected objects, possibly even tried to communicate through those symbols. It wasn't just an animal, but it certainly wasn't human either. I'm an old man now, and most who experienced those events have passed on. Thomas moved west years ago, unable to feel comfortable in those Kentucky hills anymore. James still runs the old farm, though he's converted most of it to tobacco since our parents died. As for me, I've never returned to Deep Creek, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear that unearthly yelp echoing in my mind. And I wonder if somewhere in those hills, watching and waiting, that creature still remembers us too. Story 2. In the summer of 1897, I was working a small gold claim in Siskiyou County, not far from the Oregon border. I'd been prospecting for about 3 years at that point with modest success, enough to keep me going, but not enough to make me rich. My claim was in a remote area along a creek that fed into the Klamath River, surrounded by dense forest and far from any town. The closest settlement was a small mining camp about 7 miles away, where I'd go every few weeks for supplies. That particular summer was unusually hot, and I was spending most days knee-deep in the creek, panning and sluicing. My cabin was nothing special. Just a one-room structure I'd built myself with a stone fireplace, a bunk, a small table, and some storage space for supplies and tools. I kept to myself mostly. After years of city noise and people, the solitude suited me just fine. The day I first saw it was in late July. The morning had been productive. I'd found a few small nuggets, and by mid-afternoon I was getting hungry. I caught 4 trout in the creek using a simple line and hook, something I'd gotten pretty good at over time. I was cleaning the fish on a flat rock near the water when I had the distinct feeling of being watched. I'm not normally a jumpy person. You can't be when you live alone in the wilderness, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I slowly looked around, scanning the tree line. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the familiar pines and brush. Then I noticed what looked like a bush, moving slightly about 30 yards up the slope from my position. The strange thing was, there was no wind that day. Everything else was perfectly still. I set down my knife and squinted, trying to get a better look. The bush moved again, and that's when I realized it wasn't a bush at all. It was something large, covered in hair, and it was watching me. My first instinct was to reach for my rifle, which was leaning against a nearby tree, but something stopped me. The creature wasn't making any threatening moves. It was just observing. I stood up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, and that's when I got my first good look at it. It was tall, much taller than any man I've ever seen, maybe 7 or 8 feet in height. Its body was massive and covered from head to foot in thick, dark hair that reminded me of a horse's coat, sort of reddish-brown and shaggy. The face was almost human-like, but flatter, with a pronounced brow. What struck me most were its eyes. They were a soft brown, not wild or animal-like as you might expect, but somehow intelligent, aware. The wind shifted slightly, and a powerful musky odor hit me like wet animal fur, mixed with something else I can't quite describe. Not pleasant, but not as horrible as some might think, just wild. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I'd heard stories from other prospectors and from the local Indians about something they called wild men of the mountains. But like most, I dismissed them as tall tales or superstitions. Yet here I was, face to face with something I couldn't explain. It wasn't a bear. I'd seen plenty of those. It wasn't a man in furs either. This was something else entirely. What happened next was pure instinct on my part. Instead of grabbing my gun or running away, I slowly raised my hand in what I hoped was a gesture of peace. The creature didn't move, just kept watching me with those intelligent eyes. I don't know why, but I felt no immediate danger from it, despite its imposing size. I looked down at the fish I'd caught and had an idea. These mountains and forests were its home long before they were mine. I was the intruder here, not it. So I picked up the string of clean trout, all 4 of them, and slowly laid them on a rock about halfway between us. Then I backed away, keeping my eyes on the creature. For several minutes, nothing happened. The creature remained partially hidden, watching. Then, slowly, it emerged from the cover of the trees. Standing fully upright, it was even more impressive than I'd initially thought. Its arms were long, hanging almost to its knees, and its hands, if you can call them that, were large and appeared powerful. It moved with surprising grace for something so large, making almost no sound as it approached the rock where I'd left the fish. It never took its eyes off me, and I didn't move a muscle. When it reached the fish, it quickly snatched them up with one swift movement and retreated back toward the trees. At the edge of the forest, it stopped and looked back at me for a moment before disappearing into the woods. I stood there shaking for a good while afterward, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I'd heard about encounters with wild beasts, but this felt different. There was an intelligence in those eyes that I couldn't dismiss. Later that evening, Back in my cabin with the door firmly barred, I remembered conversations I'd had with an old Shasta Indian who sometimes worked the claims nearby. He had mentioned a creature called Mata Kagmi that lived in these mountains. At the time, I'd nodded politely, but hadn't given it much thought. Now I wondered if that's what I'd seen. The following days passed without incident, though I felt watched whenever I was working outside. I kept my rifle closer than usual, but never felt the need to use it. Something told me the creature meant no harm. About 3 weeks after our first encounter, something strange happened. I was asleep in my cabin when I woke to odd noises outside. Not threatening, just unusual. It was still dark, probably around 4 in the morning. At first I thought it might be a bear or mountain lion sniffing around, which had happened before. I grabbed my rifle and cautiously approached the door. I listened for several minutes, but heard nothing more. Eventually, I cracked the door open just enough to peer out. In the dim, pre-dawn light, I could make out something on the ground just a few feet from my doorstep. I waited, listening intently, but heard only the normal sounds of the forest waking up. Finally, I opened the door fully and stepped outside, rifle ready. What I found shocked me. There, neatly piled, were several deer skins. Fresh ones that had been carefully removed from the animals. They were in perfect condition for tanning, something I'd done occasionally to trade with other miners or the local Indians. I stood there bewildered, looking around and trying to understand. That's when I heard it, a strange call from the woods, not quite a howl or a grunt, but something in between. It wasn't threatening. If anything, it seemed like an announcement. I knew immediately it was the creature, though I couldn't see it in the shadows of the early morning forest. I picked up the skins. There were 4 of them, perfectly matched to the number of fish I'd given away, and took them inside. The quality of the skinning was remarkable, better than many hunters I knew could manage. This wasn't the work of an animal or some mindless beast. This required skill and intelligence. Over the next several weeks, a strange pattern developed. Every so often, usually about once a week, I would wake to find something left near my door. Sometimes it was more skins, sometimes a pile of firewood stacked neatly, and once a collection of berries and wild fruits in a crude arrangement of branches woven together to form a kind of basket. I never actually saw the creature leave these things, but occasionally I would hear its distinctive call in the distance afterward, as if acknowledging our unusual exchange. In return, I would leave things I thought might be useful or appreciated. More fish, some salt I had extra of, and once a worn woolen blanket I no longer needed. I began to look forward to these exchanges, as strange as that might sound. There was something profoundly moving about this silent communication, this recognition between 2 entirely different beings. We never met face to face again during that time, though I caught glimpses of the creature watching from the forest edge on several occasions. The local Indians at the trading post gave me curious looks when I mentioned vague details about my forest neighbor. An elder among them nodded knowingly and said in broken English that Mata Kagmi sometimes chose certain people to acknowledge. He wouldn't elaborate further, but the respect in his voice was unmistakable. One morning in early September, I found something different outside my door, a large flat stone with crude markings scratched into its surface. They weren't any letters or numbers I recognized, just strange patterns that somehow seemed deliberate. I still have that stone, keep it above my fireplace even now. Sometimes I just sit and look at it, wondering what it means. As summer turned to fall, I continued working my claim, though with less success than earlier in the season. I was considering whether to stay through winter or move to town until spring, when everything changed in a single day. It was late September, and a storm had blown through the night before, dropping the temperature significantly. I was collecting the last of my gear from a spot upstream when I heard crashing sounds in the forest nearby, not the usual careful movements of my unseen friend, but something desperate and chaotic. Before I could react, two men burst from the trees, both carrying rifles and moving fast. They were rough-looking fellows I'd seen at the mining camp, not the neighborly type. They skidded to a halt when they saw me, clearly surprised to find anyone else out there. "You seen it?" the taller one demanded, breathing hard. "Seen what?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly what they meant. "That thing, that wild man or whatever the hell it is," the second man said. "Biggest damn creature I ever saw. We tracked it from the ridge." My stomach tightened. "I haven't seen anything," I lied. "What are you planning to do if you find it?" The tall one grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Gonna shoot it, of course. Probably fetch a fine price from one of them traveling shows or museums back east." The thought made me sick. These men saw only potential profit, not the intelligent being I'd come to know through our strange exchanges. But I knew better than to reveal my feelings to men like these. "Well, good luck to you," I said non-committally, though I'd be careful. These mountains can be dangerous for those who don't know them well. They scoffed at what they probably took as cowardice and continued on their way, heading in the general direction of where I'd most often seen signs of the creature. I waited until they were out of sight, then abandoned my work and hurried back to my cabin. I grabbed more ammunition for my rifle, some food and water, and set out to do something I never thought I would: try to find the creature before they did, to somehow warn it. I knew the forests better than those men, having lived there for months, and I had a good idea of the creature's territory. I headed toward a rocky area about 2 miles from my cabin, where I'd occasionally heard unusual sounds, echoing at dusk. The day was growing colder, and clouds threatened more rain. I moved as quietly as I could through the forest, stopping often to listen. After about an hour of careful tracking, I found what I was looking for: large, unusual footprints in the soft earth near a stream. They were fresh, heading north toward a series of rocky outcroppings. I followed the tracks for another half-mile until they disappeared among the rocks. I stood still, listening intently for any sound that might reveal the creature's location or the hunter's. The forest was unnaturally quiet, which worried me. That's when I heard it. A gunshot in the distance, then another. My heart raced as I moved toward the sound, no longer concerned with stealth. I scrambled over rocks and pushed through dense underbrush, guided by the echoes of the shots. I came to the edge of a small clearing and froze. The two men were about 50 yards away, rifles raised, aiming at something I couldn't see from my position. I heard one of them shout in excitement. Without thinking, I fired my rifle into the air. The sharp crack echoed through the trees, and both men whirled around, looking for the source. I ducked behind a large boulder, then fired again. My hope was to create enough confusion to give the creature a chance to escape. The men were shouting now, unsure whether they were being attacked. I heard them crashing through the underbrush, moving away from where they'd been aiming. I waited until their voices faded, then carefully made my way around the clearing's edge to where they had been standing. There was blood on the ground. Not much, but enough to show that they'd hit something. A trail of broken branches and disturbed earth led away from the spot, showing where something large had fled. I followed it, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The trail led to a small ravine with a shallow stream at the bottom and continued up the other side. The blood spots were more frequent now, concerning me. I crossed the stream and climbed the opposite bank, following the signs of passage. At the top of the ravine, the forest opened into another small clearing, and there it was. The creature was leaning against a tree, one hand, or paw, I'm not sure what to call it, pressed against its side, where dark blood matted the thick fur. It saw me immediately and made a rumbling sound deep in its throat, not threatening, but clearly in pain and wary. I slowly set my rifle down on the ground and raised my hands, trying to show I meant no harm. "They're trying to kill you," I said, not knowing if it could understand words but hoping my tone would convey my meaning. "You need to go further up the mountain, away from here." The creature watched me with those intelligent brown eyes that had struck me during our first encounter. It was breathing heavily, clearly injured, but not severely so. After a moment, it straightened up and looked past me, then back at me. It made a sound unlike anything I'd heard before, almost like speech, but not quite. Then, to my amazement, it actually pointed with one long arm toward the north, then at me, then north again. The meaning seemed clear. Go that way, with me. I hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'll help you," I said. I picked up my rifle, which caused the creature to tense, but I just slung it over my shoulder to show I wouldn't use it. For the next several hours, I followed the creature through the forest, deeper into the mountains than I'd ever gone before. Despite its injury, it moved with remarkable speed and agility, always staying just ahead of me, but occasionally stopping to ensure I was still following. The terrain became increasingly difficult. Steep slopes, dense vegetation, rocky outcroppings that required careful climbing. Late in the afternoon, as the light was beginning to fade, we came to a sheer rock face with what appeared to be a narrow opening at its base, partially hidden by brush. The creature paused here and looked back at me. It made that same unusual sound from before, then ducked into the opening. I followed cautiously, finding myself in a narrow passage that opened into a small cave. The ceiling was just high enough for the creature to stand upright, which meant I could move comfortably. What I saw inside amazed me. The cave was clearly a dwelling of sorts. There were crude sleeping areas made from piled vegetation and what looked like animal hides. One corner contained a collection of unusual objects, colorful stones, interesting pieces of wood, a few man-made items that must have been found or taken, including what appeared to be a rusted metal cup and an old axe head. The creature moved to the back of the cave where water dripped from the ceiling into a small natural basin. It dipped its hand into this and began to clean its wound. I could now see it was a bullet graze along the ribs, painful but not life-threatening. I removed my pack and took out some cloth I had brought along. Moving slowly, I approached and offered it for the wound. The creature studied me for a long moment before accepting the cloth. Our hands briefly touched, and I was struck by how similar yet different they were from human hands. Larger, with longer fingers and thicker palms, but recognizably hand-like in structure. I spent several hours in that cave, watching as the creature tended to its wound and eventually settled onto one of the sleeping areas. I sat near the entrance, wondering what to do next. The hunters would likely give up at nightfall, especially if they thought they were being shot at, but they might return with others. As darkness fell outside, the creature did something that still gives me chills when I think about it. It approached where I sat and lowered itself to the ground across from me. Then, very deliberately, it began to make markings in the dirt floor of the cave with its finger, patterns similar to those on the stone it had left at my cabin. I watched, transfixed, as it created what appeared to be a map. I recognized the shape of the river and what seemed to be the location of my cabin. Then it marked other areas with different symbols. It pointed to a particular marking, and then to itself, then to another marking that I took to be my cabin, and then to me. I believe it was showing me our two territories and acknowledging our unusual relationship. But then it did something more. It drew a line through the area around my cabin and made a sweeping motion with its hand that I interpreted as "go away." It wasn't threatening, rather, it seemed to be warning me. I got the distinct impression it believed the area was no longer safe for either of us. We spent that night in uneasy companionship in the cave. I dozed occasionally, but never fully slept, too overwhelmed by the strangeness of my situation. The creature seemed to rest, with one eye always open, alert to any sound from outside. When dawn came, it rose and motioned for me to follow. We exited the cave, and the creature led me through the forest by a different route than we had come. After about 2 hours of walking, I recognized landmarks near my cabin. The creature stopped at the edge of familiar territory and made that same pointing gesture, this time toward my cabin, then far away, again seeming to tell me to leave. I nodded, understanding its meaning. "Thank you," I said, feeling inadequate, but not knowing what else to say. The creature held my gaze for a long moment with those intelligent brown eyes. Then it reached out slowly and, with one finger, touched the center of my chest lightly. I don't know why, but tears came to my eyes at this gesture. Without another sound, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I returned to my cabin to find it undisturbed. Over the next 2 days, I packed my essential belongings and prepared to leave. On my last night there, I left a small pile of supplies outside my door, salt, some tools, and other things that might be useful. It was my way of saying goodbye. In the morning, the items were gone, replaced by that same flat stone with the strange markings that I had returned to its place by my door weeks ago. I picked it up, feeling its weight and tracing the patterns with my finger. It's the only physical evidence I have of what happened during those strange months. I left Siskiyou County the next day and never returned to that claim. I've prospected in other areas since then, but nothing has ever compared to that extraordinary summer. To this day, I wonder about the creature, whether it recovered fully, whether it still watches from the forest edge as strangers enter its territory, whether it remembers our brief connection across an unbridgeable divide. I've never told this story before now. Who would believe it? But every word is true. Sometimes at night, I still dream of those intelligent brown eyes watching me from the forest, and I wonder what might have happened if those hunters had never come, if that peaceful exchange could have continued through the changing seasons. Story 3. I've been sitting on this story for years, wondering if I should even share it. My grandmother passed away last month at 96, and going through her belongings, I found her journal where she'd written everything down exactly as it had happened. Since she's gone, and I'm the only one left who knows the full truth of what happened that day, I feel like I need to tell someone. This all took place in the winter of 1900. My grandmother, Elizabeth Thompson, was just 8 years old. She was traveling with her parents, James and Margaret, and her older brother, William, who was 14. They had hired a driver named Caleb Jenkins to take them through the Killdeer Mountains in Dunn County, North Dakota, in a horse-drawn sleigh. The family had been visiting relatives in Montana and were heading back to their homestead near Dickinson. According to my grandmother's journal, the weather had been unusually harsh that winter. The temperature had dropped to well below zero for weeks, and the snow was piled higher than anyone had seen in decades. They'd started their journey early that morning, around 5 o'clock, while it was still dark. My great-grandfather James had insisted they leave at first light to make it through the mountain pass before nightfall. The journey was expected to take a full day, and nobody wanted to be caught in the mountains after dark, especially not in those temperatures. The sun had finally risen around 7:30, but it didn't offer much warmth. The sky was clear blue, and the sun made the snow blindingly bright. I remember how my grandmother described it in such detail, how the sleigh runners made a high-pitched squeak as they glided over the snow, how their breath froze in the air before their faces, and how the horses' nostrils steamed like kettles. They'd been traveling for about 4 hours, making good time despite the conditions. The sleigh had been specially outfitted for the journey with extra blankets, hot bricks wrapped in flannel at their feet, and thermoses of hot coffee and chocolate. My great-grandmother had packed a hearty lunch of bread, cheese and salted pork, which they planned to eat once they reached the halfway point. It was around 11 in the morning when they entered the narrowest part of the pass. The trail wound between steep rock walls with snow-laden pines clinging to the slopes above them. My grandmother wrote that the silence was absolute except for the sounds of the horses and sleigh. No birds, no wind, just the muffled crunch of snow and the jingling of the harness bells. Caleb Jenkins, the driver, was a man in his 50s who knew the territory well. He'd been driving these routes for over 20 years and was known for his steady nerves and knowledge of the terrain. But what happened next shook even him. My grandmother wrote that she was looking out at the snow-covered landscape when she noticed something moving on the ridge to their right. At first, she thought it was snow falling from a tree, or maybe a deer. She tugged on her brother's sleeve to point it out, but before she could speak, the thing stood upright. Even from a distance of about 200 yards, they could tell it was massive. It was standing on a flat outcropping of rock, and my grandmother estimated it was at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark, matted fur, but what struck her most was how human-like its silhouette was against the snow. For a moment, everyone in the sleigh froze. My great-grandfather whispered, "What in God's name is that?" And Caleb just shook his head slowly, his face pale beneath his beard. Then the creature began to move. It didn't lumber or shuffle like a bear. It walked, strode, on 2 legs, with long, powerful steps down the snowy slope toward them. My grandmother wrote that there was a terrible purposefulness to its movement, like it had spotted them and made a decision. The horses sensed it too. They began to stamp and snort, tossing their heads against the reins. Caleb was struggling to control them, whispering soothing words that seemed to have no effect. As the creature got closer, now maybe 100 yards away, they could see more details. Its arms were long, hanging almost to its knees. Its head was set directly on broad shoulders, with hardly any neck visible. The face was dark, partly hidden by the fur, but my grandmother swore she could see eyes, not animal eyes, but intelligent, aware eyes that were fixed directly on them. That's when the horses panicked. The lead horse reared up, almost pulling the sleigh over. The other horse tried to bolt, and suddenly they were being jerked forward as Caleb fought for control. My great-grandfather shouted for everyone to hold on as the sleigh tilted precariously on one runner. In the chaos, my grandmother kept her eyes on the creature. It had stopped briefly when the horses reacted, watching them with what she described as an almost curious tilt to its head. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it changed direction. With astonishing speed for something so large, it pivoted and bounded up over the ridge, disappearing from view in seconds. It took Caleb nearly 5 minutes to calm the horses. They were lathered with sweat despite the cold, their eyes rolling wildly. When they finally stopped trembling, everyone sat in silence, looking at each other with the same unspoken question. "Did you all see that?" my great-grandfather finally asked, his voice unnaturally high. They all nodded. There was no question about what they'd seen, though none of them could explain it. My great-grandfather was a practical man. After the initial shock wore off, he insisted they investigate. My great-grandmother protested, wanting to leave immediately, but he was adamant. "If there's something dangerous in these mountains, we need to know what it is," he said. Caleb secured the horses, making sure they were calm and tying them firmly to a pine tree just off the trail. My great-grandmother stayed in the sleigh with my grandmother, while my great-grandfather William and Caleb trudged through the snow to where they'd first seen the creature. What they found shocked them even more than the sighting itself. There, clear as day in the pristine snow, were tracks. Enormous, unmistakably foot-shaped impressions that my great-grandfather measured with his hands. In her journal, my grandmother recorded his exact words when he returned to the sleigh. 16 inches, if they're a day, with a stride that would shame any man alive. 4 feet between steps, at least. The men followed the tracks for nearly half a mile. The trail led up over the ridge and down the other side, through a stand of pines, and finally disappeared at a rocky outcropping where the snow had been blown clear. They searched the area for almost an hour, but found no further sign of the creature. When they returned to the sleigh, Caleb was visibly shaken. "I've been traveling these mountains for 20 years, he told them. and I've heard stories, but I never believed them until today. My great-grandmother, practical as her husband, insisted they continue their journey. Standing around in the cold wasn't helping anyone, and the sooner they reached Killdeer, the better. With frequent glances at the surrounding slopes, they continued on their way. The rest of the journey was tense. Every snapping branch or distant sound made them start. My grandmother wrote that she kept her face buried in her mother's coat, too frightened to look out at the passing landscape. Her brother William, on the other hand, kept vigilant watch, his father's spare rifle across his knees, though what good it would have done against something that size, no one wanted to contemplate. They reached Killdeer just as dusk was falling. The tiny settlement was nothing more than a cluster of buildings, a general store, a small hotel, and a few houses. But after their experience in the mountains, it seemed like the safest place on earth. My great-grandfather immediately reported what they'd seen to the local sheriff, a man named Thomas Wilson. Sheriff Wilson listened to their account with a thoughtful expression, but didn't seem as surprised as they expected. "You're not the first to see it," he told them after they'd finished. "The Mandan have stories about a tall man of the mountains that go back hundreds of years. They call it Chiatanka, the big elder brother." The sheriff explained that several hunters and trappers had reported similar sightings over the years, especially during particularly harsh winters. "Game gets scarce up high when the snow's deep," he said, "forces everything down to lower elevations to feed." That night, my grandmother couldn't sleep. The family had taken rooms at the small hotel, but every creak of the building's timbers made her imagine that the creature had followed them from the mountains. Her brother William sat up most of the night by the window, watching the street below and the dark line of the mountains in the distance. The next morning, word had spread throughout the small community about what they'd seen. Several local men, along with Sheriff Wilson, organized a hunting party to track the creature. My great-grandfather joined them. Despite my great-grandmother's protests, they were gone all day, returning well after dark, exhausted and empty-handed. A heavy snowfall had begun shortly after they'd set out, obliterating any tracks they might have found. The temperature had dropped even further, making conditions treacherous. After struggling through chest-high drifts and nearly losing 2 men to exposure, Sheriff Wilson had called off the search. While the men were gone, my great-grandmother and the children were invited to the home of a local woman whose husband was part of the search party. There, they met an elderly Mandan man named Two Bears who had come to town to trade. When he overheard them talking about what they'd seen, he nodded knowingly. "The snow giant walks when the world is white," he told them in halting English. "My grandfather saw him, and his grandfather before him. He does not harm those who respect the mountains, but he does not like to be hunted." My grandmother asked if the creature was dangerous, and Two Bears considered this carefully before answering. "All things with power are dangerous," he said finally, "but he has lived beside us for generations without trouble. It is only when men go looking for him that bad things happen." Several more hunting parties were organized over the next few days, but increasingly severe weather hampered their efforts. Blizzard conditions set in, trapping everyone in town for nearly a week. By the time the weather cleared enough for travel, interest in pursuing the creature had waned as the more pressing concerns of survival in the harsh winter took precedence. My grandmother's family eventually continued their journey home to Dickinson, but she wrote that the experience changed them all. My great-grandfather, who had been planning to guide hunting expeditions in the Killdeer Mountains the following summer, changed his mind. My great-grandmother refused to travel through that pass again, insisting on longer but less mountainous routes for future journeys. As for my grandmother, she developed a lifelong fascination with the wilderness and its mysteries. Her journal contains numerous newspaper clippings about similar sightings across the country over the decades. She interviewed Mandan and Hidatsa elders, recording their stories of the mountain beings. She even returned to the Killdeer Mountains as an adult, though she never saw the creature again. The most striking thing about my grandmother's account is how matter-of-fact it is. She wasn't given to exaggeration or flights of fancy. She was a practical, level-headed woman who simply recorded what she and her family experienced that winter day in 1900. She never sought publicity for her story or tried to convince skeptics. "I know what I saw," she would say whenever the subject came up. "That's enough for me." I've often wondered what exactly they encountered that day. Was it some unknown species that has managed to evade scientific documentation? A bear walking upright? Some kind of mass hallucination brought on by the extreme conditions? But the details are too specific, too consistent with accounts from across the continent, spanning hundreds of years. The measured footprints, the intelligent eyes, the incredible speed and agility for something so large. These aren't the kind of details people make up, especially not practical pioneers focused on survival. I still have my grandmother's journal with its faded ink and yellowing pages. Sometimes I read her account and try to picture that snowy pass, the absolute silence of the winter mountains, and the shock of seeing something that shouldn't exist striding purposefully toward the sleigh. I try to imagine the fear they must have felt when the horses panicked, the sleigh nearly overturning on the narrow trail. What strikes me most is how the creature chose to leave. It could have continued toward them. They were helpless with panicking horses and a tilting sleigh, but instead, it turned away, as if deciding they weren't worth the trouble. There's something unsettling about that. The implication of decision-making, of intelligence. I've never told this story publicly before, but now that my grandmother is gone, I feel like someone should know what happened that day in the Killdeer Mountains. Someone should remember that not all the wilderness has been mapped and measured, that there are still mysteries in the remote corners of our world. Every winter, when the snow piles deep against my windows and the wind howls around the eaves, I think about that creature. I wonder if it's still out there in the mountains, watching from some hidden vantage point as our world encroaches ever further on its domain. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and the snow is falling, I swear I can feel eyes watching me from the darkness beyond my window. Intelligent, aware eyes that have seen centuries come and go in the ancient mountains. Story 4. I've been hesitating to write this down for months now, but I can't keep it bottled up anymore. What happened to us in Stewart's Woods still haunts my dreams, and I find myself waking up in cold sweats most nights. I need to get this out, even if nobody believes me. I know what we saw that night, what we heard, what we felt. Some things just ain't natural, and what we encountered in those woods was something that shouldn't exist in this world. It was the night of July 12th, 1901, a rainy summer night in Pennsylvania. Me, Milton Brint, my brother Taylor, and our good friend Tom Lukens decided to go coon hunting in Stewart's Woods, outside Pensbury Township in Chester County. We'd been hunting those woods for years, knew them like the backs of our hands. Our dogs, I had 2 blue-tick hounds, Rusty and Blue, while Taylor had his Redbone. Sadie and Tom brought his black and tan Duke, were the best coon dogs in the county. Those dogs never failed us before. The rain had just let up when we set out around 9 o'clock that evening. The ground was soggy beneath our boots, and the tree branches dripped water down our necks as we made our way deeper into the woods. Our bullseye lamps cast eerie shadows through the trees, but we didn't think nothing of it at the time. It was just another hunting night. We let the dogs off their leads, and they took off into the underbrush, noses to the ground. Nothing unusual about that. We followed at a steady pace, listening to their excited barks as they picked up scents. The night air was heavy with moisture, thick in my lungs. I remember thinking it was good hunting weather. The rain would have had the coons moving. We'd been out for maybe an hour, following the sounds of our dogs working a trail, when something changed. The barking suddenly stopped. Just stopped. Anyone who's hunted with dogs knows that ain't natural. Dogs don't just go quiet when they're on a scent, especially not 4 experienced coonhounds. You hear that? Taylor asked, cocking his head. I don't hear nothing, Tom replied, and that was exactly the problem. No barks, no baying, nothing but the drip of water from the trees and the distant rumble of thunder. My stomach knotted up right then. Something's wrong with the dogs, I said, and we picked up our pace, calling their names. That's when we heard it, whimpering. Not the excited whines of dogs that have treed something, but frightened, pitiful sounds that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We rounded a thick patch of underbrush, and there they were. All 4 dogs huddled together, tails tucked between their legs, trembling something fierce. Blue was pressed so hard against my legs when I approached that I nearly fell over. Rusty wouldn't stop whining, and Sadie, Taylor's fearless Redbone, who'd once faced down a bear, was cowering behind him, refusing to budge an inch back toward whatever had spooked them. What the hell? Tom muttered, trying to calm Duke, who was shaking like a leaf. Duke's never acted like this before. I knelt down beside Blue and tried to soothe him, but his eyes were wild with fear, darting back toward the deeper woods. Something's got them spooked bad, I said, feeling my own fear rising. Dogs know things we don't. Taylor pulled out his flask and took a swig before offering it to us. Maybe we ought to head back, he suggested, his voice unnaturally tight. I was about to agree when the dogs suddenly perked up their ears. They weren't relaxed, not by a long shot, but something had caught their attention. Blue gave a tentative bark, then another. The other dogs joined in, still nervous but seemingly gaining confidence. They've got something, Tom said, sounding relieved. Must have just been a bear or mountain lion that spooked them earlier. I wasn't so sure, but we followed as the dogs cautiously led us deeper into the woods, their behavior still off. They weren't running ahead like they normally would. Instead, they stayed close, occasionally looking back, as if making sure we were still there to protect them. After about 15 minutes of this strange procession, the dogs led us to a massive cedar tree. They circled it, barking upward, but there was something half-hearted about their efforts. They'd bark, then whine and back away, only to approach again. We raised our bullseye lamps, expecting to see the glowing eyes of a raccoon or maybe a possum reflected in the light. But there was nothing visible in the branches. You see anything up there? I asked, squinting through the darkness. Tom and Taylor both shook their heads. Nothing, Tom replied, raising his lamp higher. But something's up there. Dogs wouldn't be acting this way otherwise. That's when we heard it. A sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It was low and dismal, not quite a growl, not quite a moan, but something in between. It came from high up in the cedar tree, a sound that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever encountered in those woods. What in God's name is that? Taylor whispered, his face gone pale in the lamplight. I couldn't answer him. My mouth had gone dry as dust, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the humid July air. The dogs had backed up to us again, pressing against our legs, whimpering. Then the tree began to shake. Not like when a raccoon or even a bear is climbing. This was violent, like something massive was moving through the branches. Cedar needles and twigs rained down on us. Our lamps illuminated the swaying branches, but still, we couldn't see what was causing it. It's coming down, Tom hissed, backing up a step. Whatever was in that tree was indeed descending, shaking the whole damn thing as it moved. We could hear branches snapping, the thing grunting with effort. The dogs were going crazy now, barking in terror, but too scared to run. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like a big branch giving way. Something heavy crashed through the foliage, and at that exact moment, I swear on my mother's grave this is true, all 3 of our bullseye lamps went out at once. Just snuffed out like someone had blown them all out with one breath. We were plunged into darkness, with only the faint light of the moon filtering through the clouds and trees. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. Light! "Get a light!" Taylor was shouting, fumbling with matches. I was reaching for my own matches when I saw it. In the dim moonlight, a massive figure was picking itself up from the ground beneath the cedar. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, and broad through the shoulders. But it wasn't a man, not entirely. Its head and neck had a human-like shape, but the body, God help me, the body was like some kind of beast. It raised its head and looked directly at us. I couldn't make out its features clearly in the darkness, thank the Lord, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. A hot, rank smell hit my nostrils, like wet dog and something rotting mixed together. The creature made that same dismal sound again, louder this time, and took a step toward us. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was standing there, frozen in terror, and the next I was crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my feet slipping on the wet ground. I could hear Taylor and Tom running too, and the dogs were ahead of us, no longer even pretending to be brave. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning. All I knew was that I had to get away from that thing, that impossible thing that shouldn't exist. My lungs were burning, my legs were leaden, but pure fear kept me moving. We burst out of the woods and didn't stop until we reached Tom's wagon, which we'd left at the edge of his property. We piled in, dogs and all, and Tom whipped the horses into a gallop. None of us spoke. What was there to say? We'd left behind our hunting gear, our lamps, even Taylor's prized hunting rifle that had belonged to our father. When we finally reached Tom's house, we went inside, and Taylor broke out the whiskey. We drank in silence for a long while before anyone spoke. "We can't tell nobody about this," Tom finally said, his voice hoarse. "They'll think we're crazy or drunk or both." "What was that thing?" Taylor asked, looking at me like I might have an answer. I was the oldest, the one they always looked to for explanations, but I had none. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't want to know." We made a pact that night not to speak of what we'd seen, but the story got out anyway, as stories do in small places. We never said much, just that something had spooked us and the dogs in Stewart's woods, but people could tell by our faces that it was more than that. Our dogs didn't come home with us that night. They bolted when we got to town, too terrified to be controlled. They all showed up about a week later, half-starved and still jumpy. Blue was never the same after that night. He'd bark at nothing, cower at shadows, and he would never, ever go near the woods again. Neither would the other dogs. As for our abandoned gear, it stayed where we left it. Some folks offered to go retrieve it for us, but we warned them off. No one could have paid me enough to go back to that cedar tree. Word got around, and folks started avoiding Stewart's woods, especially at night. They call it the Pensbury Climber now, that thing in the woods. I've heard whispered theories that it's some kind of wildman or a devil or something that escaped from a circus train. I don't join in those conversations. I know what I saw, even if I can't explain it. It's been months now since that night, but I still wake up hearing that dismal moan. I still feel those eyes on me in the darkness. I still smell that rank, unnatural odor. Taylor's talking about moving west, and Tom barely hunts anymore. As for me, I haven't set foot in any woods since July. I don't know if that thing is still out there in Stewart's woods. I don't know if it was just passing through or if it's made a home there, and I don't want to know. All I know is that on a rainy night last July, 3 grown men with guns and 4 good hunting dogs ran from something that shouldn't exist. And if you're smart, you'll stay far away from Stewart's woods after dark. Some things aren't meant to be understood, and some creatures aren't meant to be seen by human eyes. I still don't know what that thing was, but sometimes, on wet nights when the wind blows through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear it calling. And I lie awake until dawn, afraid that someday it might decide to come looking for us. Dundas. Story 5. I still have trouble talking about what we saw. It's been almost 20 years, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. My name is Jacob Simcade, and back in 1904, Me and three other fellas encountered something up at Horn Lake that changed how I see the world. I'm 72 years old now, and I've carried this memory like a stone in my pocket all these years. It was early October, and me, Thomas Hutchins, Alfred Crump, and William Buss had planned a week-long hunting trip near Great Central Lake on Vancouver Island. We'd been friends for years, all of us having settled in the area around the same time. Thomas was the oldest at 42, a quiet man who'd worked in logging most of his life. Alfred was a shopkeeper from the settlement, always telling jokes, though not that day. William was the youngest at 27, strong as an ox and new to the hunting game. Me, I was 36 and had been hunting these woods since I arrived from Ontario in '95. The trip was supposed to be routine. We'd done it a dozen times before. We set up camp about a mile from Horn Lake on the evening of October 3rd. The weather was crisp but not yet bitter, perfect for tracking deer. We had enough supplies to last us the week, and spirits were high that first night. We sat around the fire, passing a flask of whiskey and swapping stories like men do when they're away from their wives and children. The next morning started normal enough. We woke before sunrise, had a quick breakfast of coffee and hardtack, and split into pairs. Me and Thomas headed northeast, while Alfred and William went northwest, planning to circle back to camp by sundown. The forest was dense that year, thicker than I remember it being before. The pines grew so close together in spots that you had to turn sideways to squeeze through. We'd been out for about 4 hours, following what looked like promising deer tracks, when Thomas grabbed my arm and pointed to a small clearing about 50 yards ahead. At first I thought he'd spotted a buck, but there was something off about the way he tensed up. His face had gone pale. "Jacob," he whispered, his voice shaky. "What in God's name is that?" I squinted through the trees, and that's when I saw it. Crouched by a fallen log was what looked at first glance like a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old judging by the size. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized this was no child at all. The creature was covered head to toe in brown hair, not like fur exactly, but more like human hair that had never been cut. It was matted in places, especially around what I assumed was its head. The face. I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It was long, almost stretched looking, with deep-set eyes that I couldn't make out clearly from where we stood. And it had a beard, not a full man's beard, but definitely hair growing from its chin and jawline. Its arms seemed longer than they should be, and its hands, they looked almost human, but bigger, stronger. Thomas and I stood frozen, afraid that the slightest movement would scare it away or, worse, provoke it somehow. The creature was digging at something in the dirt, using its fingers with surprising dexterity. Every now and then, it would put something in its mouth. Roots, maybe, or insects. I remember thinking how human-like that simple gesture was. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two, we watched in silence. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure Thomas could hear it. Then, I made a mistake. I shifted my weight and a twig snapped under my boot. The sound was deafening in the quiet forest. The creature's head snapped up instantly, looking directly at us. Our eyes met, I swear on my life, and in that moment I felt something I can't fully explain. It wasn't just fear, though there was plenty of that. It was recognition of something intelligent, something aware. Those eyes knew what they were seeing. Then it moved, and God Almighty, I've never seen anything move like that before or since. 1 second it was crouched by the log, and the next it was gone. Not just running, but almost flying through the brush. The speed was impossible. The underbrush where it disappeared was so thick that it would have taken me 5 minutes to crawl through it. But this thing went through like it wasn't even there. Thomas let out a breath I don't think he knew he was holding. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw it," I replied, my mouth dry as sand. "What was it?" We stood there for another minute, both of us trying to make sense of what we'd witnessed. Then, almost as if we'd agreed without speaking, we started toward the log where the creature had been. The forest felt different now, like we were being watched from every direction. When we reached the spot, there was clear evidence something had been there. The dirt was freshly turned, and there were what looked like small holes where roots had been pulled up. And there were footprints, unmistakably footprints, but unlike any I'd ever seen. They were roughly the size of a child's foot, but wider, with toes that seemed more spread out than a human's. And they were deeper at the front, as if whatever made them walked more on its toes than flat-footed. We followed the tracks as best we could, but they disappeared into that dense underbrush. Thomas tried to push through, but came back scratched and cursing after only a few feet. "We need to get Alfred and William," he said, and I agreed. We hurried back to camp, hoping the other two had returned early. They hadn't, so we waited, both of us too shaken to speak much. When they finally showed up around 4 in the afternoon, we told them what we'd seen. Alfred laughed at first, thinking we were pulling his leg, but something in our faces must have convinced him. "A wild boy?" William asked, his brow furrowed. "Like a feral child?" "No," I said firmly. "Not a boy, not human, at least not entirely. It moved wrong, too fast. And the face." Alfred suggested we all go back to the spot before the light faded completely. None of us wanted to be out there after dark, not anymore, but we had to know if there was something to what Thomas and I had seen. The 4 of us returned to the clearing, rifles at the ready, though none of us said what we thought we might need them for. The evidence was still there, the disturbed earth, the strange footprints. Alfred knelt down to examine them, his earlier skepticism giving way to genuine curiosity. "I've never seen tracks like these," he admitted. "Not bear, not wolf, not anything I recognize." William, who'd grown up near a Kwakwaka'wako settlement and knew some of their stories, was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke up. "The natives talk about something they call bokwus," he said. "Small, hairy creatures that live in the forests. They're supposed to be impossibly fast, able to disappear in the blink of an eye." "That's just superstition," Alfred replied, but there wasn't much conviction in his voice. We decided to follow the tracks as far as we could. The light was fading, but with 4 of us hacking at the brush, we made better progress than Thomas and I had earlier. The trail led toward Horn Lake, winding through the densest parts of the forest, as if deliberately choosing the most difficult path. After about half an hour of slow progress, we emerged at the lake's edge. The tracks led right to the water and disappeared. The lake was still that evening, like glass, reflecting the darkening sky. We stood there catching our breath, scanning the shoreline for any sign of the creature. "It could have gone anywhere from here," Thomas said. "Could have swum across or followed the shore in either direction." We spread out a bit, each searching a section of the shoreline. I headed east, keeping my eyes on the ground for more tracks. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. The forest had always been my second home, but now it felt alien, unwelcoming. I'd gone maybe 100 yards when I found another set of the same strange footprints leading out of the water and back into the woods. They were fresh, the water still seeping into the impressions. My heart began racing again. "Over here," I called to the others, trying to keep my voice steady. Before they could reach me, I heard a sound from the trees to my right, not a breaking branch or animal call, but a sort of low, rumbling breath. I turned slowly, my rifle half raised, and that's when I saw it again. The creature was standing about 20 yards away, partially hidden behind a thick pine trunk. This time it was upright, and I could see that it stood about 4 feet tall. Its eyes caught what little light remained, reflecting back with an amber glow. For a few seconds we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. There was intelligence in those eyes, curiosity even. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying me the way I was studying it. Then I heard the others approaching, their boots heavy on the forest floor. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and again it moved with that impossible speed. One moment it was there, the next gone, leaving only swaying branches in its wake. By the time the others reached me, there was no sign it had ever been there at all. "I saw it again," I told them, my voice shaking. "It was watching me." We searched the area until it became too dark to see, but found nothing except a few more partial footprints. As night closed in, a growing sense of unease pushed us back toward camp. None of us mentioned leaving early, but I know the thought crossed all our minds. That night around the campfire, we spoke in low voices about what we'd seen. William told us more about the Bockwus legends he'd heard, how they were said to be spirits of the drowned who now lived in the forest, how they could run faster than deer, how they sometimes lured people deep into the woods where they'd become hopelessly lost. "That's not what we saw," Thomas insisted. "This was flesh and blood." "Then what was it?" Alfred asked. Nobody had an answer. We took turns keeping watch that night, though I don't think any of us slept much, even during our off hours. Every sound from the darkness seemed magnified, significant. During my watch, from about 2 until 4 in the morning, I heard something moving around the perimeter of our camp, just beyond the firelight. I kept my rifle ready and stoked the fire higher, but whatever it was never showed itself. At dawn, we decided to cut our trip short. The hunting spirit had gone out of us all. We packed up camp quickly, barely speaking as we worked. Just before we left, William found something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of our campsite, clearly visible in the morning light, was a line of those same footprints circling our entire camp. They hadn't been there the previous evening. "It was watching us all night," William said quietly. The walk back to the settlement was tense. We stayed close together, jumping at shadows, no one wanting to be at the back of the line. It was mid-afternoon when we finally emerged from the forest and saw the familiar buildings of home. Only then did some of the tension leave my shoulders. We reported what we'd seen to the local authorities, though I could tell from their faces they thought we were exaggerating or had simply seen a bear cub. A few days later, a party of men went back to Horn Lake to investigate. They found some unusual tracks around the lake, but nothing conclusive. The creature itself was never seen again, at least not by anyone who reported it. The local Kwakwaka'wakw people were less surprised by our story. An elder named Joseph told me they'd known about the small forest people for generations. "They don't show themselves often," he said. "You were either very lucky or very unlucky to see one, depending on how you look at it." In the weeks that followed, I found myself questioning what I'd seen. Could it have been a bear cub walking unusually? A child from some unknown settlement who'd grown up wild? But I couldn't explain the speed, the way it moved through impenetrable brush, those eyes that held something more than animal awareness. Alfred eventually convinced himself it had been some kind of joke or mass hallucination. Thomas rarely spoke of it at all. William became obsessed for a time, making several trips back to Horn Lake alone, though he never saw anything again. As for me, I've never returned to that part of the forest. Some things once seen change you in ways that can't be undone. I've written all this down in my journal over the years, recording every detail while it's still fresh in my mind. Maybe someday someone will make sense of what we saw that day. All I know is that the forests of Vancouver Island hold secrets that most people wouldn't believe. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough and the light is just right, you might catch a glimpse of something watching you from between the trees. Something that doesn't belong to the world as we understand it. I still dream about those eyes sometimes, looking back at me from the shadows. And I wonder if somewhere in those dense woods it remembers me too. Story 6. I've never been much for sharing personal stories online, but after keeping this inside for so many decades, I feel like I need to tell someone. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of what happened. I'm an old man now, but this memory from my childhood remains as vivid as if it happened yesterday, not back in 1910. I was 10 years old, living with my family on our property in New South Wales. It was a different time then. No electricity, no running water in the house, just us, the land, and whatever we could make of it. My father was a hard-working man who'd carved out a modest plot for us, with sheep and a small garden that my mother tended. My younger brother Charlie was only 7 at the time, small for his age, but eager to help with chores. That summer was particularly dry. The creek that ran through the eastern part of our property had shrunk to a trickle in some spots, so fetching water became a daily priority. Usually, it was my job to collect water for the house, and Charlie would tag along to keep me company. Our 2 kangaroo dogs, Scout and Digger, always followed us everywhere. The day it happened started like any other. It was mid-afternoon, the sun beating down with that merciless Australian heat that makes the air shimmer. Mum had asked us to fetch another bucket of water for cooking supper. It wasn't a long walk to the creek, maybe 15 minutes from our house, along a narrow dirt path that wound through some scrubby bush. "Come on, Charlie," I said, grabbing the metal bucket from beside the back door. "Let's get going before it gets too hot." Charlie jumped up from where he'd been playing with some sticks and followed me. Scout and Digger were already circling us excitedly, knowing the routine. They were good dogs, loyal and smart. I'd never seen anything scare them before that day. The walk to the creek was familiar, and we chatted about nothing in particular as we went. What we might have for dinner, whether Dad would let us help with the new fence he was building. The bush around us buzzed with cicadas, and occasionally we'd spot a lizard darting across the path. It was ordinary in every way. The creek was about half a mile from our house, in a slight gully with eucalyptus trees providing some shade. As we approached, the dogs trotted ahead of us as they always did, nose to the ground, tails wagging. I remember thinking about how low the water was and wondering if we'd have to move rocks around to create a deeper pool for collecting. We were maybe 50 yards from the creek when everything changed. The first warning was the dogs. They both stopped dead in their tracks, their ears perked up, bodies suddenly rigid. I'd seen them alert to rabbits or other animals before, but this was different. There was tension in their posture I'd never seen. "What's wrong with Scout and Digger?" Charlie whispered, moving closer to me. Before I could answer, there was a rustling sound from the dense bushes to our right. Not the gentle rustling of a small animal or a bird, but something heavy moving through the undergrowth. The dogs started to whine, not barking like they would at a stranger or a dingo, but a high-pitched, frightened sound that made my skin prickle. Then we saw it. It burst from the bushes about 20 yards ahead of us, crossing the path in 3 or 4 massive strides before disappearing into the thicker vegetation on the other side. It was so quick that I barely had time to process what I was seeing, but the image burned itself into my memory forever. It was tall, so much taller than my father, who stood 6 feet himself. It must have been over 7 feet, maybe even 8. But it wasn't just the height that was shocking. It was covered completely in dark, coarse hair. Not like fur exactly, but longer and shaggier. The hair was a deep brown, almost black, except around its face, which seemed slightly lighter. Its arms were unnaturally long, swinging at its sides as it ran in a way that wasn't quite human. Its legs were powerful and bent oddly, taking huge strides. The way it moved was like nothing I'd ever seen. Not quite like a man, not quite like an animal, but something in between. It had a strange, hunched posture, with its head thrust forward and shoulders rounded. I only caught the briefest glimpse of its face, but what I saw has haunted my dreams for decades. It wasn't a man's face, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The brow was heavy and protruding, the nose flat and wide. I couldn't make out its eyes clearly, but they seemed deeply set under that prominent brow. The encounter lasted maybe 5 seconds at most, but time seemed to suspend in that moment. Then the spell broke. Our dogs, Those fearless hunters that had faced down wild boars without blinking, turned tail and bolted back toward home, yelping in terror. Their panic triggered our own. Charlie dropped to the ground, sobbing. I stood frozen for another second, the bucket dangling uselessly from my hand, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. "Norman?" Charlie choked out between sobs. "What was that?" I couldn't answer him. My mouth was bone dry. I just grabbed his arm, yanked him to his feet, and we ran. We ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, not daring to look back, convinced that the creature was right behind us. Charlie kept stumbling, and I kept dragging him along. The bucket was left forgotten on the path. By the time we reached the house, we were gasping for breath, our faces streaked with tears and sweat. Mum was hanging laundry and turned to us with alarm. "What on earth?" she started, but we were already pushing past her, rushing into the house. Dad was at the table, mending a saddle strap. He looked up as we burst in, his expression changing from surprise to concern. "It's you!" I shouted, pointing an accusing finger at him. "You tried to scare us!" It was the only explanation my 10-year-old mind could come up with. Dad sometimes played practical jokes. This had to be one of them, a man in some kind of costume. It had to be. Dad stood up, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about, Norman?" "At the creek. You dressed up like some kind of monster to frighten us." My voice was shaking and I was fighting back tears. Charlie was clinging to me, still sobbing. "It was big and hairy, Dad. Really big. The dogs ran away." Dad's face changed then, in a way I'll never forget. The color drained from it, and he exchanged a quick glance with Mum, who had followed us inside. "Sit down, boys," he said quietly, his voice more serious than I'd ever heard it. "Tell me exactly what you saw." We described the creature as best we could. Its height, the dark hair, the strange way it moved, those unnaturally long arms. With each detail, Dad's expression grew grimmer. When we finished, he stood up abruptly and went to get his rifle from above the fireplace. "George, what are you doing?" Mum asked, her voice tight with worry. "Checking around the property," he replied, loading the gun. "And no, boys, it wasn't me playing a trick. I've been here all afternoon." He paused, looking at both of us intently. "From now on, neither of you goes to that creek alone, you hear me? Not ever. If you need to fetch water, I'll go with you, or you'll take one of the hands." "What was it, Dad?" I asked. He hesitated, as if deciding how much to tell us. "Some people call it a yowie. The Aborigines have known about them for thousands of years. My father saw one once, when he was about your age." "Is it dangerous?" Charlie asked in a small voice. "I don't know, son," Dad replied honestly, "but I'm not taking any chances." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside my window made me pull the blankets tighter around me. I kept seeing those few seconds replayed in my mind. The creature bursting from the bushes, its strange gait, those long arms. I wondered if it had been watching us all this time, on all our previous trips to the creek. The next day, Dad rode out to visit our nearest neighbors, the Wilsons, who lived about 5 miles away. When he returned that evening, I overheard him talking to Mum in low voices. "Tom Wilson said his father used to tell stories about them," Dad was saying. "Says they show up more during dry seasons, near water sources. The Aborigines on the Wilsons' property call them yowies and say they've been here since the dream time." "Do you really believe it's one of those creatures?" Mum asked, sounding skeptical. "I don't know what else it could be," Dad replied. "No man is that tall or moves that way, and nothing else would scare those dogs like that." The following week, Dad and 2 of our farmhands dug a new well closer to the house. We never collected water from the creek again, at least not without several adults and rifles. Dad also started keeping the dogs closer to the house, especially as dusk approached. A few days after our encounter, Dad took me along to visit old Jack, an Aboriginal elder who sometimes worked odd jobs around nearby properties. Old Jack listened to my description without surprise, nodding occasionally. "Yowie," he confirmed when I finished. "They stay in the deep bush, but the dry brings them to the water. My grandfather saw one carry off a calf once, just picked it up like it was nothing." "Why haven't more people seen them?" I asked. Old Jack gave me a long look. "They're clever. They watch, hide, been here longer than us, know the land better." He tapped the side of his nose. "They can smell you coming from a mile away. Most times they don't want to be seen." "Then why did this one show itself to us?" Dad asked. "Maybe in a hurry, maybe curious about the boys." Old Jack shrugged. "Maybe warning you away from its territory." On the ride home, I asked Dad if he believed old Jack's stories. "I believe you saw something, Norman," he said after a long pause. "Something that wasn't a man and wasn't a regular animal. Beyond that..." He trailed off, staring at the distant hills. "There are things in this country that we don't understand. Best to be respectful and cautious." In the weeks that followed, I often thought I glimpsed movement at the edge of the bush, or heard strange calls at night that weren't quite animal, not quite human, but we never had another clear sighting of the creature. As the months passed, Charlie seemed to forget much of the incident, or at least he stopped having nightmares about it. But I couldn't forget. It shaped me in ways I'm still discovering. I became more watchful, more aware of my surroundings. I developed a deep respect for the bush and its mysteries. When I was 16, I ventured back to that creek alone, rifle in hand. I don't know what I was hoping to find, proof perhaps, or closure. The creek was flowing strongly that year, the drought long past. I sat for hours, watching and listening, but nothing came. Yet I never shook the feeling of being observed, of eyes tracking my movements from the dense undergrowth. I'm 87 years old now. I've lived a full life, fought in a world war, raised a family, buried a wife. I've seen incredible changes in this country and this world, but nothing has affected me as deeply as those few seconds on a summer day in 1910, when something impossible crossed my path. I can still see it so clearly, the way it moved, that distinctive gait, those impossibly long arms. Sometimes I wake up at night, heart pounding, convinced I've heard heavy footsteps outside my window. The rational part of my mind says it was just a man, or my childish imagination exaggerating a large animal, but deep down, I know what I saw. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal we have names for. It was something else, something ancient that was here long before us. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I wonder if it's still out there, moving silently through the bush, watching and waiting. The Aborigines believe the Yowie has existed since the dream time. After what I saw that day, who am I to say they're wrong? Story 7. I still remember that day as if it happened yesterday, even though it's been over 10 years now. October 1912. The date is burned into my memory. I was 37 then, had been hunting in the bush since I was old enough to hold my father's rifle. Nothing in all those years prepared me for what I saw at Packer Swamp. I'd gone out alone that morning, which wasn't unusual for me. The wife needed meat for the week, and I'd promised her I'd bring back something decent. The swamp was a good spot, plenty of game if you knew where to look and had the patience to wait. I knew that area like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. It was a clear day, unusually warm for October. I'd been out since dawn, moving quietly through the bush, following fresh tracks. Nothing substantial yet, just a few rabbits in my bag. Not enough to justify the trip. The sun was climbing higher, and I remember thinking I should head deeper toward the creek where the animals would go to drink in the midday heat. The bush was quiet that day, too quiet, looking back. No birds singing, no rustling in the undergrowth. Should have been my first clue, something wasn't right. But I didn't pay it much mind then, just focused on the hunt. I came to a small ridge overlooking one of the creek bends. Good spot for watching without being seen. I settled in, rifle across my lap, and waited. That's what hunting is mostly, waiting and watching. The sun was hot on my back, flies buzzing around my face. I batted them away absently, eyes fixed on the water below. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a man, maybe one of the station hands from the property that bordered the swamp, but something about the way it moved wasn't right. It came through the scrub on the opposite side of the creek, moving with a strange rolling gait, arms hanging unusually long at its sides. I froze completely, didn't even swat at the flies anymore, just watched as this thing approached the water. I was about 150 meters away, upwind, thankfully, hidden by the ridge and some scrub. It hadn't seen me. As it got closer to the creek, I could make out more details, and my blood went cold. This was no man. It stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was like a great trunk, no real waist to speak of, just straight from broad shoulders to hips. But it was the arms that really got me. They hung down almost to its ankles, swinging oddly as it walked. The entire thing was covered in coarse grey hair, not fur exactly, more like very thick hair all over its body. Not patchy like you'd see on a mangy animal, but full coverage. In the sunlight, I could see it had a silvery sheen to it. Its face, God, its face is what haunts me still. It had a man-like quality, but wrong somehow. No proper forehead to speak of, just a heavy brow that shadowed the eyes. No chin either, just a face that seemed to merge straight into that thick neck. The nose was flat and wide, and the mouth... I couldn't make out much detail at that distance, but it seemed too wide for a human face. I was gripping my rifle so tight my knuckles were white, but I didn't raise it. Something told me not to move, not to make a sound, just watch. I wasn't scared exactly, more like stunned into absolute stillness. The creature crouched at the edge of the creek. It moved with purpose, not like a wild animal, but like something with intelligence. It cupped its hands, yes, hands, not paws, and began to drink from the creek, just like a person would. That's what was so unsettling about it. It wasn't entirely beast-like, but it certainly wasn't human either. I must have watched it drink for nearly 5 minutes. My heart was pounding so hard, I was amazed it couldn't hear it from across the creek. Every instinct told me to leave, to back away slowly and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from this impossible thing. After it finished drinking, it straightened up and looked around. For one terrible moment, I thought it had spotted me. Its head turned in my direction, and I swear I stopped breathing entirely. But its gaze moved on, scanning the bush around it. Then it did something I'll never forget. It leaned down and picked up a stick from the ground, just casually, like you or I might do. It held the stick for a moment, seemed to examine it, then carried it as it turned and walked away from the creek, back the way it had come, disappeared into the thick scrub beyond. I stayed completely still for what must have been 20 minutes after it left, afraid it might return. My legs had gone numb from crouching so long in one position. When I finally felt safe enough to move, I nearly fell over as the blood rushed back. I should have left then, should have gone straight back to town. But curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what I'd seen, had to find proof. I made my way carefully down to the creek, rifle ready, senses on high alert. I crossed at a shallow point and approached the spot where the creature had been drinking. The ground there was soft from the creek overflow, good for holding impressions. And there they were, footprints, large ones, much bigger than my own boots, and I'm not a small man. But it wasn't just the size that was strange. They looked almost human in shape, but with only 4 toes instead of 5. And the way they pressed into the mud showed unusual flexibility, more like a hand than a foot. Next to the footprints, I found handprints where it had crouched to drink. Again, 4 fingers only, no thumb that I could make out. The fingers were long, the palm wide and flat. I placed my own hand next to one print for comparison. Its hand was nearly twice the size of mine. I spent a good hour examining that creek bank, looking for hair samples or anything else the creature might have left behind. Nothing, just the prints in the mud and the disturbed vegetation where it had walked. The sun was starting to dip lower, and I suddenly realized I didn't want to be in Packer Swamp after dark. Not anymore. I headed back toward town with a quick step, looking over my shoulder the whole way. The weight of my rifle was reassuring, but I wasn't sure it would do much good against whatever I'd seen. When I got back to town, I went straight to Constable Fletcher's office. He'd known me for years, knew I wasn't given to tall tales or drunken imaginings. He listened patiently as I told him what I'd seen, taking notes and asking the occasional question. "You're sure it wasn't a very large Aboriginal man?" he asked, though I could tell from his expression he already knew the answer. "No man stands 7 feet tall with arms to his ankles," I told him, "and no man I've ever met has only 4 toes." Fletcher frowned at that. "4 toes, you say? That's unusual." "There's more," I continued, describing the creature's odd body shape and the way it had picked up the stick before leaving. When I finished, Fletcher was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed and closed his notebook. "George," he said, using my first name like he did when we weren't on official business, "I believe you saw something. I've known you too long to think you'd make this up. But I need to ask, have you told anyone else about this?" I shook my head. "Came straight here." "Good. Let me organize a search party for the morning. We'll go out, look at these prints, see if we can track this thing. But let's keep it quiet for now, all right? No need to cause a panic." I agreed, though I was burning to tell someone else, to validate what I'd seen. Fletcher promised we'd head out at first light with a few trusted men. That night was one of the longest of my life. My wife noticed something was off, but I didn't tell her, didn't want her scared to sleep. I lay awake most of the night, replaying the encounter in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, almost human but not quite, staring in my direction. Morning couldn't come fast enough. Fletcher had gathered 5 men, himself, me, the blacksmith Tom Harris, and 3 stockmen from the nearby station who knew the bush well. We set out just as the sun was breaking over the horizon. But we were too late. It had rained heavily during the night, one of those sudden spring downpours that come out of nowhere. By the time we reached the creek, the bank had been washed clean. The distinct prints I'd seen were gone, replaced by mud and debris from the rain. "Damn it all," Fletcher muttered, kneeling by the creek edge. "Nothing left to see." The others looked disappointed, and I could tell a couple of them were already doubting my story. Tom Harris, the blacksmith, gave me a sympathetic look. "We believe you saw something, George," he said quietly. "Just a shame the rain washed away the proof." We spent most of the day searching the area, looking for any sign of the creature. Found nothing conclusive. A few broken branches high up that might have been caused by something tall passing through. Some tufts of coarse hair caught on bark that could have come from any number of animals. When we returned to town, empty-handed and tired, the talk started. Word had gotten out, despite Fletcher's caution. By evening, half the town knew I claimed to have seen some kind of creature in the swamp. Most were skeptical, of course. Some outright mocked me. But there were a few, mostly the older folks and those who'd lived in the area their whole lives, who listened with serious expressions and nodding heads. Old Bill Tandy, who ran the general store and whose grandfather had been one of the first settlers in the area, pulled me aside the next day. "The Aboriginal people have stories about something in that swamp," he told me, his voice low. "Been telling them for generations. Call it the Yoroma. Say it's always been there, that the swamp is its territory." "What kind of stories?" I asked, eager for any confirmation. "Say it's tall, covered in hair. Say it takes people who wander too deep into the swamp alone. Been a few disappearances over the years that never got explained." He gave me a significant look. "You're lucky it didn't see you, George. I wasn't sure if I believed in monsters taking people, but I knew what I'd seen, and hearing that the Aboriginal people had names and stories about something similar made me feel less crazy. The days after were difficult. Some people in town started avoiding me, as if what I'd seen might somehow be catching. Others wanted to hear the story over and over, each time asking more detailed questions I couldn't answer. A few of the younger men organized their own searches of the swamp, armed with rifles and bravado, looking for the monster. They never found anything, of course. A reporter from the regional paper came to interview me. I told him exactly what I'd seen. No embellishments, no theories, just the facts as I'd experienced them. The article ran the following week, and suddenly I was getting letters from people in other towns who claimed to have seen similar things in different parts of the bush. The attention died down eventually, as these things do. New gossip replaced the old, but I never forgot, never stopped seeing that figure by the creek when I closed my eyes at night. I haven't been back to Packer Swamp to hunt, haven't been able to bring myself to go there, though it's been 10 years now. My wife thinks I'm being silly, says lightning doesn't strike twice. Maybe she's right. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and the night is still, I imagine I can hear something moving outside. Something large, with a rolling gait and arms that hang too low. Something that watches and waits and remembers me just as clearly as I remember it. I know most people reading this will think it's just another bushman's tall tale. Something to tell around campfires to scare the young ones. I don't blame you for doubting. I would too, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. All I know is this: the bush holds secrets, deep old secrets that don't fit neatly into our understanding of the world. I glimpsed one of those secrets that day at Packer Swamp, and sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, picking up sticks and drinking from creeks, watching and waiting for the next person to stumble into its territory. I've never told anyone this last part, but a week after our failed search, I went back to the edge of the swamp alone. Don't ask me why. Curiosity or madness, perhaps a bit of both. I didn't go deep, just stood at the periphery, staring into those shadowy depths. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, placed carefully on a fallen log at the very edge of the swamp, was a stick. Not just any stick. It was peeled and stripped of bark in exactly the same way as the one the creature had picked up, placed precisely, deliberately, where I would see it. I didn't touch it, just backed away slowly and left. Never told anyone until now. But I've always wondered, was it a warning or an invitation? And what would have happened if I'd picked it up? Story 8. I've been sitting on this story for decades, never telling anyone outside my close family. I guess I'm finally at the age where I don't really care what people think anymore. What happened to my colleagues and me back in 1912 has haunted me for my entire life, and writing it down might help me process it, even after all these years. I was 28 at the time, working as a surveyor with the Department of Lands. My name is Phillips Mills, and I was sent with 2 geologists, Walter Green and Henry Bancroft, to survey a remote mountainous area near Beige in New South Wales. This was fairly routine work for us, though the terrain was challenging. We were mapping potential mining areas, and the geologists were collecting samples to determine mineral deposits. It was early October, and the weather had been unusually cool. We'd been in the field for nearly a week, setting up different camps as we worked our way through the area. The particular evening I'm writing about was our 4th night out. We'd hiked about 12 miles that day through some of the roughest terrain you could imagine. Steep inclines, loose rocks and dense brush. By the time we decided to make camp on the western slope of the mountain, we were completely exhausted. We found a small clearing surrounded by tall eucalyptus trees and some dense bushland beyond. There was a small creek about 50 yards away, which was perfect for our needs. Walter and I set up the tents, while Henry gathered wood for the fire. The sun was already sinking behind the mountains, and the shadows were growing longer. There was that peculiar stillness that sometimes comes over the bush in the evening when the daybirds have gone quiet, but the night creatures haven't yet begun their chorus. We got the fire going just as darkness fell. The flames were a welcome comfort after the tiring day. We heated some canned beans and made strong black tea in a beat-up old pot. The three of us sat around the fire on fallen logs, eating our simple meal and discussing the day's findings. Henry was particularly excited about some rock formations he'd discovered that suggested copper deposits. I remember the moment perfectly. I was scraping the last of my beans from the tin plate and half listening to Walter and Henry debate about something geological that went over my head. I glanced up, past the fire, toward the tree line about 30 yards away. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a tall, dark shape standing at the edge of our firelight. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. You know how shadows dance when you've been staring at a campfire too long. But then it shifted slightly, and I realized there was definitely something there. Something big. "Hey," I said, my voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "Look over there." Walter and Henry fell silent and turned to look where I was pointing. The three of us sat frozen, watching as this figure moved slightly closer to our camp. As it did, the firelight illuminated it more clearly, and I felt my blood run cold. Standing there just at the periphery of our camp was what I can only describe as a massive ape-like creature. But it wasn't an ape, not exactly. It walked completely upright like a man. It must have been at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, with a massive, muscular frame. The firelight caught its features in an orange glow, and I could see dark, thick hair covering most of its body. Not fur, exactly. More like very coarse human hair. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, with huge hands that hung at its sides. Its legs were thick and powerful looking, ending in large, bare feet, but it was the face that shook me to my core. It wasn't the face of an animal, not completely. It was like someone had combined the features of a man and an ape. The brow was heavy and pronounced, but the eyes beneath, those eyes, they reflected the firelight in a way that seemed almost thoughtful. They were deeply set in the face, dark and watchful. None of us spoke. I don't think any of us could find words. The creature just stood there, observing us with what appeared to be curiosity. It made no threatening moves, showed no aggression. It just watched us. I could hear Henry's breathing beside me, growing more rapid. From the corner of my eye, I saw his hand slowly moving toward his pack, where I knew he kept his revolver. Without taking my eyes off the creature, I placed my hand on Henry's arm and squeezed, signaling him not to go for the gun. I can't fully explain why I did that. Maybe it was fear that shooting would provoke it, but honestly, I think it was something else. There was something in that creature's demeanor, in those eyes, that seemed almost human. Not in appearance necessarily, but in presence. It wasn't behaving like a wild animal. There was an intelligence there that made the thought of shooting it seem wrong somehow. The creature stood watching us for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, as Henry tried to subtly shift position again, it seemed to notice the movement. It turned unhurriedly and walked away into the darkness of the bush. It didn't run or bound away like an animal fleeing danger. It walked with a smooth, powerful gait, showing no fear whatsoever. Once it disappeared into the darkness, we all let out the breath none of us realized we'd been holding. "What in God's name was that?" Walter whispered, his voice shaking. "A bear?" Henry suggested, though his tone made it clear he didn't believe his own words. "There are no bears in Australia," I reminded him, my mouth dry. And whatever that was, it wasn't like any animal I've ever seen or heard of. We spent the rest of that night in a state of high alert. None of us suggested packing up and leaving, partly because traveling through that terrain in darkness would have been suicide, and partly because, if I'm honest, we were too shaken to make any rational decisions. We took turns keeping watch, feeding the fire to keep it burning brightly through the night. I took the first watch. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze had me jerking my head around, scanning the darkness beyond our firelight. But there was nothing, no sign of our visitor. When it was Walter's turn to watch, I tried to sleep but couldn't. I lay in my tent with my eyes wide open, straining to hear any unusual sounds over Walter's occasional movements by the fire. During Henry's watch, I must have finally drifted off from sheer exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, weak morning light was filtering through the canvas of my tent. I emerged to find Henry still sitting by the smoldering remains of our fire, his revolver now openly in his hand, his face pale and drawn from lack of sleep. "Anything?" I asked him. He shook his head. "Nothing. Not a sound out of place all night." Once Walter woke and joined us, we decided to investigate in the daylight. Moving cautiously and staying together, we circled our campsite, looking for any sign of our night visitor. We found them about 20 yards from where the creature had been standing. Footprints, large, human-like footprints pressed deep into the soft earth. They were much larger than any of our boots, perhaps 15 or 16 inches in length, with 5 distinct toes. The stride length between them was enormous, confirming the creature's considerable height. We followed the tracks as far as we could. They led into a rockier area where they became impossible to trace. We stood there at the edge of the rock field, looking up at the dense bush beyond, all of us wondering the same thing. Was it still watching us? By unspoken agreement, we decided to pack up camp and move to another location. None of us verbalized our fear. We were grown men, professionals, and admitting to being terrified would have seemed childish. But I know we all felt it. As we gathered our equipment, I noticed how often each of us glanced up at the surrounding forest, and how we all kept much closer together than usual. We moved about 5 miles that day, though we had originally planned to stay in that location for another day at least. We barely spoke as we hiked, each lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. That night, at our new campsite, we finally talked about it properly. We sat close around another campfire, speaking in low voices, as if afraid of being overheard. "It couldn't have been a man," Walter said firmly. "No man is built like that. The proportions were all wrong. And no man has eyes that reflect firelight that way," Henry added. "Like an animal's eyes do." "But it wasn't an animal either," I said. "Not any animal we know of." We debated what to do, whether to report what we'd seen when we returned to civilization. In the end, we decided against it. Who would believe us? 3 educated professionals claiming to have seen some kind of man-ape in the Australian bush. We'd be laughed out of our jobs. Professional ridicule was a real concern for men in our positions. So we kept it to ourselves. We completed our survey, collected the geological samples, and returned to Sydney a week later. We never spoke of the incident to anyone else, though occasionally, when we met in later years, we would reference it obliquely, each confirming to the others that no, we hadn't imagined it, and no, we still had no explanation for what we'd seen. Over the years, I've read accounts of similar sightings: the Yeti in the Himalayas, Bigfoot in North America. Australia has its own legends too, the Yowie they call it. I never paid much attention to those stories before that night. I dismissed them as folklore or hoaxes. But now I'm not so sure. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what we saw. Could it have been a very tall man living wild in the bush? Possibly, but that doesn't explain the inhuman proportions, the strange eyes, or the way it moved. Some undiscovered species of great ape. Australia has no native great apes. An escaped circus animal? That seems absurdly unlikely in such a remote location. The truth is, I've never found a satisfactory explanation. The 3 of us witnessed something that shouldn't exist according to science, yet we saw it with our own eyes. Walter passed away in 1942 and Henry in 58. I'm the last one left who was there that night. I've kept this story private for most of my life, partly out of fear of ridicule, partly because I still don't know what to make of it myself. But what I do know is this: what we saw was real. It was there, watching us with those intelligent eyes that have haunted my dreams for decades. And sometimes, even now, when I'm alone in my house at night and hear an unexpected sound outside, I find myself wondering if those eyes are out there still, watching from the darkness beyond my windows. I've never returned to that part of the mountains. I couldn't bear to. Not because I'm afraid of encountering that creature again, though that's certainly part of it, but because I'm afraid of not finding any trace of it, afraid of being forced to question my own memory, to wonder if the three of us somehow shared the same delusion. The encounter lasted only minutes, but it fundamentally changed how I view the world. It opened up the possibility that there are things out there we don't understand, creatures we haven't classified, mysteries we haven't solved. I'm an old man now. My surveying days are long behind me, but that October night in 1912 remains as vivid in my mind as if it happened yesterday. Those eyes reflecting the firelight, that massive silhouette against the darkness, those enormous footprints in the morning dew. These things I will never forget. I don't expect anyone to believe this account. I wouldn't if I hadn't experienced it myself. But it happened exactly as I've described it. And somewhere out there, in the wild places that still exist in this world, I believe that creature, or others like it, still watches from the shadows, occasionally revealing itself to the unlucky or the fortunate, depending on how you look at it. As for me, one such encounter was enough for one lifetime. But I still find myself looking a little longer at the shadows when I'm outdoors at night, wondering what might be looking back. Story 9. I've been holding on to this for too long. The year was 1912, and I was leading a 5-man surveying team through the bush in New South Wales. My name is Charles Parker, and before that night, I considered myself a rational man of science, a proper surveyor from Sydney with 10 years of field experience. What we encountered changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world. We were 2 weeks into a government contract to survey large sections of undeveloped land about 100 miles west of Sydney. Nothing spectacular had happened during our expedition until that night. It was early winter, with that peculiar Australian chill that settles into your bones after sunset. The day had been productive. We'd mapped nearly 5 miles of difficult terrain, working through dense bush and over several small ridges. My team consisted of myself, 2 junior surveyors named Thomas and William, and 2 local guides, Jim and Harold, who knew the region well. By late afternoon, we were exhausted but satisfied with our progress. We made camp in a small clearing near a creek. The spot seemed perfect, sheltered from the wind by a ridge to the south, with fresh water nearby and enough flat ground for our tents. After a simple dinner of salt pork, damper bread and tea, we gathered around the campfire as we typically did each evening. This was our routine. We'd discuss the next day's route, make notes in our journals, and occasionally share stories to pass the time. It must have been around 9 in the evening. The sky was perfectly clear. I remember looking up and commenting on how bright the stars appeared. The fire was burning low, and I was just suggesting we add more wood when Harold suddenly froze mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on something beyond the firelight. "What is it?" I asked, reaching for my rifle out of instinct. Harold didn't respond. He just raised his hand slowly, pointing toward the darkness at the edge of our camp. At first I saw nothing. Then a movement caught my eye. Something large shifting between 2 trees, about 20 yards from our position. I thought it might be a kangaroo or perhaps a wild dog, but as I squinted into the darkness, I realized with a sinking feeling that it was something else entirely. The creature stepped forward, just enough for the firelight to catch it. I'll never forget that moment, the sudden ice-cold feeling that spread through my chest. It was roughly the height of a man, perhaps 5'8" or 5'10", but that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Its entire body was covered in long, brownish hair that seemed to quiver with each movement, like reeds in a gentle breeze. The hair wasn't matted as you might expect from an animal living in the bush. It hung in long strands, particularly around its shoulders and chest. William let out a strangled sound beside me. I wanted to tell him to be quiet, but I couldn't find my voice. We all sat there, frozen, as the creature took another step forward. That's when it started. Lord, help me. It began thumping its chest with its paws in a rhythmic pattern. The sound was hollow, yet powerful, like someone beating a drum covered with thick cloth. With each thump, it released a low, threatening growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. Thomas, who was sitting closest to the creature's side of the camp, simply collapsed. One moment he was upright, clutching his journal, and the next he was sprawled on the ground, unconscious from sheer terror. None of us moved to help him. We couldn't. I was afraid that any sudden movement might provoke the thing into charging. In the flickering firelight, I could make out more details of this wild man. Its arms were unnaturally long, with forearms that seemed disproportionate even to those elongated limbs. But it was the face that haunts me still. Deep-set eyes, impossibly large and reflecting the firelight like two dark pools. They didn't blink, not once during the entire encounter. Most disturbing were its teeth. Even with its mouth closed, I could clearly see a pair of long canines protruding over its lower lip. They weren't like a predatory cat's, more like those of a wild boar, but longer, yellowed with age. When it opened its mouth to growl again, I saw rows of worn teeth behind those canines. The sound that emerged wasn't animal-like, not exactly. It had an almost deliberate quality to it, something close to language but twisted and primitive. Its hands ended in fingers that seemed far too long, with joints that bent at odd angles. I remember thinking they looked almost like tools, specialized for some unknown purpose rather than just appendages. The creature's legs were perhaps its most peculiar feature. The proportions were all wrong. The upper leg, the femur bone I assume, was extraordinarily long compared to a human's, while the lower portion seemed stunted. This gave it a sort of hunched appearance despite standing upright, and then there was its stomach. God, it was grotesque. The belly hung like a loose sack, drooping halfway down its thighs. It wasn't fat exactly, more like the skin had stretched over the years and never recovered. I remember wondering if it was female and had carried young, but nothing else about its appearance suggested gender one way or another. For what felt like eternity, but was probably only 5 or 6 minutes, the creature continued its display. Thumping, growling, occasionally shifting its weight from one foot to the other. Not once did it take its eyes off our group. It seemed to be assessing us. There's no other word for it. This wasn't mindless animal behavior. There was intelligence behind those eyes, a calculating presence. Jim had slowly reached for his rifle during this standoff, but I placed my hand on his arm to stop him. Something told me that firing at this thing would be catastrophic. Either we'd miss in our panicked state and enrage it, or worse, we'd wound it and trigger an attack. Better to remain still and hope it would lose interest. Harold was whispering something under his breath. Prayers, I think. William was trembling so badly I could hear his teeth chattering. Thomas remained unconscious on the ground, which was probably a blessing for him. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature decided it had had enough. Without any obvious trigger, it turned away from our camp. It took several steps on 2 feet, an awkward, loping gait that nonetheless covered ground quickly. Then, in a motion that seemed practiced and efficient, it dropped forward onto all fours and disappeared into the darkness of the bush. The sound of it crashing through the undergrowth faded within seconds. It moved with surprising speed and silence for something so large. For nearly 10 minutes after it left, none of us spoke. We just sat there, staring at the spot where it had been. Finally, Jim broke the silence. "We need to get Thomas inside a tent," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This simple, practical statement broke whatever spell had been holding us. William and I moved to help Thomas, who was beginning to stir. Harold immediately set about building up the fire to a roaring blaze, piling on far more wood than we typically used. No one objected. We all wanted as much light as possible. We managed to revive Thomas with some water and settled him in his tent, though he was disoriented and kept asking what had happened. When we told him, he became agitated, insisting we were playing a cruel joke on him. It wasn't until he saw the genuine fear in our faces that he began to accept the truth. None of us slept that night. We took turns keeping watch, rifles across our laps, jumping at every sound from the surrounding bush. I used the time to document everything I could remember in my field journal, drawing rough sketches of the creature and noting its proportions and behaviors while they were still fresh in my mind. As dawn finally broke, we held a brief conference. Thomas and William flatly refused to continue the survey. They were adamant about returning to Sydney immediately. Harold seemed torn. As a local guide, his professional pride was at stake, but I could see the fear lingering in his eyes. Jim suggested we move to a different area, perhaps 5 or 10 miles away, to continue our work. After some discussion, we reached a compromise. Thomas and William would return to the nearest settlement with a portion of our supplies and equipment. Harold, Jim and I would relocate our camp that day and attempt to continue the survey in a different section. If anything unusual happened again, we'd abandon the project entirely. As we packed up camp, I found myself repeatedly looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The bush, which had always been simply a workplace to me, had transformed overnight into something menacing and unknown. Thomas and William left within the hour, taking our fastest horse and a basic supply pack. The rest of us moved camp as planned, traveling nearly 7 miles to the northwest before setting up again. The new location was more exposed, a deliberate choice. We wanted clear sight lines in all directions. That night passed without incident, but none of us relaxed. The next day, Jim spotted large, unusual footprints crossing our path about a half-mile from camp. They resembled a human's, but far larger and with an odd distribution of weight, as if the creature walked with its weight on the outer edge of its feet. We followed them for a short distance before they disappeared into rocky terrain. That was enough for Harold. He announced he was heading back, and nothing I said could dissuade him. By mid-afternoon, I was left with only Jim to continue the survey. We lasted one more day before abandoning the project entirely. The work was impossible with just 2 men, and neither of us could focus. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the undergrowth had us reaching for our rifles. This wasn't scientific surveying anymore. It was an exercise in fear. We returned to Sydney 3 days later. I submitted an incomplete report to my supervisors, citing difficult terrain and insufficient manpower as the reasons for our failure. What else could I say? That we'd been frightened away by some unknown creature. I'd have been laughed out of the department. Thomas and William never returned to field surveying. Thomas took a desk position with the government land office, and William left the profession entirely. Jim continued working as a guide, but refused any jobs in that particular region. Harold, I heard, moved away from the area shortly after our return. As for me, I continued my career, but never returned to that specific section of New South Wales. I kept my field journal with its detailed account of what we saw, but I've shown it to no one until now. It's been several months since that night, and I still wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those unblinking eyes and protruding teeth fresh in my mind. I've researched extensively, looking for any similar accounts from the area, I found a few vague stories from Aboriginal sources about hairy men living in the bush, but nothing with the specificity of what we encountered. I don't know what we saw that night. Was it some unknown species of great ape that had somehow survived in isolation? A deformed human living wild in the bush? Or something else entirely? I can't say, but I know what I saw, what we all saw. It was real, it was intelligent, and it's still out there, somewhere in the wilds of New South Wales. Whatever your beliefs, whatever scientific explanations you might offer, I implore you to consider this. Australia is vast, with enormous tracts of land, virtually untouched by European exploration. Who can say with certainty what might be living in those remote regions? What might have evolved in isolation over countless millennia? I've told my story. Believe it or dismiss it as you will. But if you find yourself working in the bush of New South Wales, keep your fire burning bright, your companions close, and your eyes on the darkness beyond the light's edge. You never know what might be watching from the shadows. Story 10. I've been holding on to this experience for so long. My son's grandchildren are adults now, and I'm in my 80s. But what happened that summer day in 1913 has haunted me my entire life. I've never shared this publicly before, but I need to get it out before I'm gone. We lived on our family farm just outside Newark, Ohio. Those were simpler days, no electricity yet in our area, just hard work from sunup to sundown. My husband Jacob ran the farm with help from our boy Thomas, who was 13 that summer. We weren't wealthy, but the land provided for us. We grew vegetables, raised some livestock, and supplemented our pantry with whatever the woods offered. Mushrooms, nuts, and especially berries. That July morning started like any other. The day was warm but not unbearably hot, with high wispy clouds, perfect berry-picking weather. My husband had gone into town for supplies, so Thomas and I decided to gather blackberries for preserves. I packed a light lunch, grabbed our picking baskets, and we set off toward the eastern woods, where the blackberry bushes grew thick along the old path. The eastern section of our property had always been different from the rest of the land. The trees grew denser there, blocking much of the sunlight. The birds sang less. Even on bright days, it felt somehow darker, cooler. Jacob rarely hunted in that part of the woods despite good game, saying it didn't feel right. I never paid much mind to it. Superstition, I thought. We'd been picking for maybe an hour, our baskets half full with plump berries, when I noticed the change in the air. It's hard to describe, a heaviness like before a storm, but the sky was mostly clear. I looked up and saw something odd directly above us. At first, I thought it was just a small storm cloud, darker than the others and oddly shaped. But as we moved along the path deeper into the woods, I realized the cloud seemed to move with us. I remember pointing it out to Thomas. "Look at that strange cloud following us," I said. He squinted upward and nodded, looking concerned. "That's not right, Ma," he said quietly. His voice had only recently begun to deepen that year, but in that moment he sounded like a small child again. I tried to reassure him. "Just a trick of the wind, I'm sure." But deep down, I felt uneasy. That cloud wasn't moving like clouds do. It stayed directly above us no matter which direction we walked, and it seemed to be getting darker, more concentrated. We continued picking, moving deeper along the path. I walked ahead, about 30 or 40 feet from Thomas, wanting to check the bushes around the bend where they'd been especially fruitful the previous year. The path twisted through the trees, lined with blackberry bushes on both sides. I remember the scratches on my arms from reaching into the thorny bushes, the purple stains on my fingers. That's when I felt it, that awful feeling of being watched. Not by a person, not by an animal, but by something wrong. I froze, my hand halfway to a cluster of berries. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze, just a terrible, pressing silence. I turned slowly to look back at Thomas, about to call for him to stay close, when I saw it from the corner of my eye. To our right, maybe 20 yards away, partially obscured by trees but clearly visible, stood something I can only describe as a nightmare made flesh. It was standing upright like a man, but everything about it was wrong. It was tall, taller than my husband, who stood 6 feet, and impossibly broad across the shoulders, like 2 men standing side by side. The shoulders must have been at least 4 feet wide, but what struck me most was its head, or rather the lack of any normal head and neck. Its massive head seemed to sit directly on those enormous shoulders, as if someone had pushed its neck down into its body. It was covered in dark hair or fur, not black exactly, but a deep, unnatural brown-black that seemed to absorb the light around it. I couldn't make out facial features clearly from that distance, thank the Lord, but I could sense it was looking right at us. The most disturbing thing was how it moved. It was walking parallel to our path, matching our pace exactly, but its gait was all wrong. Fluid, but somehow mechanical at the same time. Like someone trying to imitate human walking without ever having seen it properly. Each step was too precise, too calculated. It didn't sway naturally like a person does. For a few terrible seconds, I couldn't speak. My throat closed up with fear. I finally managed to turn toward Thomas and screamed, "Run! Thomas, run!" My voice sounded strange even to me, higher and more panicked than I'd ever heard myself. When I yelled, the thing stopped and fully turned toward us. That's when I heard the sound, not quite a growl, not quite a bark, but something in between, a deep, throaty noise that no human or animal I've ever heard could make. It was a sound of pure malice. Thomas had seen it too. His face had drained of all color, and his picking basket dropped from his hands, spilling berries across the dirt path. He didn't hesitate when I screamed. He turned and ran back the way we'd come, and I was right behind him. I've never run so fast in my life. Branches whipped at my face and arms. I stumbled over roots, but somehow kept my footing. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and each breath was painful. All I could think about was getting my boy away from that thing. I kept looking back over my shoulder, terrified I would see it gaining on us with those unnatural strides. But the strangest thing happened. After we'd run about 100 yards, I risked looking back one more time, and there was nothing there, no sign of the creature. The path behind us was empty. I glanced up, and even that dark cloud was gone, the sky normal again. The sounds of the forest had returned, birds calling, insects buzzing. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods. We collapsed in the field between the forest and our farmhouse, gasping for breath. Thomas was crying, and I realized tears were streaming down my face too. By the time we could speak, all I could manage was, "Did you see it?" Thomas nodded, his face still ashen. "What was it, Ma? What was that thing?" I had no answer then. I have no answer now. 70 years later, we made it back to the house and locked every door and window. When Jacob returned that evening, we told him everything. He believed us immediately. He'd had his own odd feelings about those woods for years, though he'd never seen anything there. From that day forward, we never went into the eastern woods again. Jacob forbid it, and neither Thomas nor I had any desire to return. Word spread quickly among the neighboring farms. Parents told their children to stay away from our eastern woods. No one picked berries there anymore, despite how plentiful they were. When children asked why, they were given vague warnings about bad air or dangerous animals. No one wanted to speak directly about what Thomas and I had seen. It was easier to pretend it was something else, something normal. About 5 years later, a developer from Columbus came through, looking to buy parcels of woodland for lumber. Jacob, against my objections, sold him the eastern section, partly for the money, but I think partly because he wanted those woods cleared. The developer sent a team of 10 men with equipment to begin clearing. They lasted less than 2 days. The foreman came to our house on the second day, hat in his hands, looking nervous. He told Jacob his men refused to continue working. Their equipment kept breaking down inexplicably. 2 saws had shattered on seemingly normal trees. But more than that, the men all reported the same thing, an overwhelming sense of dread that got worse the deeper they went into the woods. Several of them said they felt like they were being watched. One man, an experienced lumberjack who'd worked forests all over Ohio, quit on the spot after claiming he'd heard an inhuman bark-like growl from the dense underbrush. The developer abandoned the project and never returned for his equipment. It may still be there, rusting away amongst the trees. The eastern woods remained untouched, and our family avoided that section of our property like it was poison. Thomas moved away after the Great War, wanting distance from both the memories of combat and, I think, from those woods. He rarely brought up what we'd seen, and when he did, it was obliquely, referring to it only as that day. But I know it affected him deeply. He never let his own children play in any forest, unsupervised, no matter where they lived. For years, I told myself we'd seen a bear standing oddly in the shadows, or maybe a very large man with a deformity. But I know, in my heart, it was neither of those things. What we encountered was something not meant to be seen by human eyes, something that didn't belong in our world. I've read accounts over the years of similar creatures, what some call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Some descriptions match aspects of what we saw, but none capture the wrongness of it. The unnatural proportions, the way it moved, that terrible dark cloud that hovered above us. No natural creature would have those features. I still have nightmares about it. In them, I'm back on that path, but I'm alone. Thomas is gone. The thing is there, always just behind me, no matter how fast I run. I never see its face in the dreams, but I can hear that barking growl getting closer and closer until I wake up screaming. I've never returned to Newark. My husband passed in 1945, and I moved to Columbus to be near my sister. Sometimes I wonder if the thing is still there, walking those woods with its strange gait, waiting for someone else to stumble across its path. I don't know what we experienced that day. I can't explain the dark cloud or the creature with no neck. I can't rationalize the abandoned equipment or the dread that drove away hardened lumberjacks. All I know is that something impossible happened on our farm in 1913, and not a day goes by that I don't think about it. Whatever was in those woods that day, it wasn't something that should exist in our world. And the worst part is knowing that it might still be out there, waiting. Story 11. It's been over 50 years since that day, but I can still feel the cold sweat breaking out on my back when I think about it. I've tried to rationalize what happened countless times, but I'm an old man now, and I figure I might as well write this down before taking the memory to my grave. It was late May of 1917. I was 17 years old, working as a timber scaler's assistant at one of the lumber camps along the Cowlitz River in Washington. It was hard work, but decent pay for a young man. Most days I'd measure and grade logs, mark them, and help keep records. The camp was bustling with men from all backgrounds, some veterans from the Spanish War, immigrants, local boys like me looking to earn their way. That Saturday, word had spread about a dance being held at the meeting hall about 3 miles from our camp. In those days, social gatherings were precious, especially in remote areas like ours. I'd been looking forward to it all week. There would be girls from the nearby settlement, music, and a brief escape from the monotony of camp life. I'd even saved up to buy a new shirt for the occasion. I finished my work around 6 in the evening. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the tall firs. The foreman, Mr. Garrett, asked if I wanted to catch a ride with him and some of the other men, but they weren't leaving for another hour. Being young and impatient, I decided to walk. It would take me less than an hour on foot, and I wanted to arrive early to help set up, hoping to make a good impression on Sarah, the daughter of one of the camp cooks, who I'd had my eye on for months. "You sure about walking alone, Fletcher?" Garrett asked, lighting his pipe. "Getting dark soon." "It'll be light enough," I assured him. "And I know the road well." He shrugged. "Suit yourself. Watch for cougars. Tom Wilkins claimed he saw a big one near Miller's Creek yesterday." I nodded, not particularly concerned. I'd grown up in these woods. Wildlife didn't scare me much. I grabbed my jacket and set off down the main logging road that curved through the forest toward the settlement. The walk started pleasantly enough. Birds were calling their evening songs, and the sweet smell of pine sap hung in the air. The road was well packed from logging trucks and horse carts. I walked at a brisk pace, thinking about the dance, about Sarah, about the songs I hoped the band would play. About 20 minutes in, the sun dipped below the tree line. The forest didn't immediately go dark. There was still that bluish twilight that lingers in the northwest. But shadows grew deeper, and the spaces between trees turned to ink. That's when I first felt it. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a presence. The feeling of being watched that prickles the back of your neck. I stopped and turned around, scanning the road behind me. Nothing seemed out of place. Just the empty dirt road winding back toward camp. I continued walking, but slightly faster. The feeling persisted, growing stronger. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few yards. Each time the road remained empty, but the sensation of eyes on me intensified. "Just nerves," I muttered to myself, "or a deer watching from the trees." But it didn't feel like being watched by a deer. It felt deliberate, intelligent. After another quarter mile, I heard what sounded like footsteps behind me, not directly behind, but off in the woods parallel to the road. Heavy steps breaking twigs, displacing underbrush. I stopped again and listened. The sound stopped too. "Hello," I called out. "Someone there?" My voice sounded thin in the darkening forest. No response came, except for the faint rustling of wind through the canopy. I stood motionless for nearly a minute, straining to hear anything unusual. Nothing. Maybe it had been a deer after all. I resumed walking faster now. The dance hall couldn't be more than 1.5 miles away. I'd be there in 20 minutes if I kept up my pace. No reason to let my imagination run wild, but the feeling wouldn't subside. Minutes later, I heard the footsteps again, this time closer to the road. Heavy, deliberate steps matching my pace, but staying just within the tree line. Stop when I stopped, move when I moved. I was genuinely frightened now. I considered running, but worried that whatever was tracking me might give chase. I'd heard stories of cougars stalking people, but they typically avoided humans. Bears were a possibility, but they usually made more noise. The road ahead curved sharply to the right, around a massive old-growth fir. As I approached the bend, some instinct, something primal that I can't explain, made me duck behind a large cedar tree just off the road. I pressed my back against its rough bark, heart hammering in my chest, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Not 30 seconds after I'd hidden myself, something emerged onto the road exactly where I'd been walking. In the deepening twilight, I could make out a large, upright figure. My first thought was that it was one of the loggers playing a cruel joke. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized with absolute certainty that what stood on the road was no man. It was tall, easily 6.5 or 7 feet in height. It walked on 2 legs like a human, but there was something profoundly wrong about its proportions. Its arms hung longer than a man's should, reaching almost to its knees. Its entire body was covered in dark hair, not clothing, but actual hair or fur that seemed to be part of its skin. The hair appeared thickest around its shoulders and chest, which were massively broad compared to its waist. Its face, God help me, its face had a human quality that made it all the more terrifying. Not human enough to be a man, but human enough to show intelligence. Dark eyes set deep under a prominent brow ridge. A flattened nose, what looked like a beard of sorts covering the lower portion of its face. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It stood there, head turning slowly as it scanned the road ahead. It seemed confused, as if it had lost track of its prey, of me. It lifted its head slightly, and I swear it was smelling the air. That's when my body betrayed me. A surge of pure terror rose up, and before I could stop myself, a strangled yell escaped my throat. The creature's head snapped in my direction with unnatural speed. Our eyes met across 30 feet of twilight road, and in that instant, I knew with absolute certainty that this was no animal, not in the way we understand animals. There was calculation in those eyes, purpose. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush away from the road, away from the creature, pushing through salal bushes and ferns, branches whipping at my face. Behind me came sounds of pursuit, heavy footfalls and the crack of breaking branches. Whatever it was, it moved through the forest with far more agility than I could manage. It was gaining on me. I changed direction, angling back toward the road but further ahead. If I could reach the road again, maybe I could outrun it on the open path. My lungs burned. My legs felt like lead. The logical part of my brain kept saying this couldn't be happening. But the animal part of me, the part connected to our ancestors who hid from predators in the night, knew this danger was real. Something whistled past my ear, a rock or stick that had been thrown with considerable force. It splintered against a tree trunk just ahead of me. The thing was throwing objects, trying to stun me. I broke through the tree line back onto the road and sprinted forward, not daring to look back. I could hear it crashing through the forest behind me, seemingly paralleling my course rather than following directly. It was herding me, I realized with horror, like a predator steering its prey. The road forked ahead. One path continued toward the settlement and dance hall. The other veered west toward an abandoned logging site that had been cleared out the previous year. For a split second, I considered the western path. It would be more direct to the settlement as the crow flies, but something told me that's exactly what the creature anticipated. I took the main road, pushing myself to run faster than I ever had. My chest felt like it might explode, but pure fear kept me moving. Behind me, I heard a sound that still haunts my dreams, a low, vibrating call that was neither animal nor human, but something in between. It echoed through the forest, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. And then came answering calls from ahead of me, from the direction of the settlement. There were more of them. I skidded to a halt, terror freezing me in place, caught between pursuers. For several seconds, I stood paralyzed in the middle of the road as the calls continued, communicating in some primitive language I couldn't comprehend. To my left was a steep embankment leading down toward the river. Without further thought, I plunged over the edge, half sliding, half falling down the slope, grabbing at roots and saplings to slow my descent. Rocks and dirt cascaded around me, and pain shot through my ankle as it twisted beneath me, but I kept moving. At the bottom was a narrow game trail that ran parallel to the river. I limped along it as quickly as my injured ankle would allow, the pain dulled by adrenaline. The rushing water of the Cowlitz masked any sounds I might have made, but it also prevented me from hearing if I was being followed. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, the trail widened and joined a larger path that I recognized, the river route that some of the men used for fishing. It would lead to the settlement from the south. If I could follow it without being detected, I might reach safety. The forest was nearly dark now, but a quarter moon provided just enough light to make out the path. I moved as quickly and quietly as my injured ankle would permit, listening for any signs of pursuit. Occasionally, I heard distant calls echoing through the forest, always answered by others from different directions. They were communicating, coordinating. I came to a small clearing and saw lights ahead through the trees. The settlement. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't stop. I hobbled forward, emerging from the forest at the southern edge of the small cluster of buildings. The dance hall was lit up with lanterns, and I could hear music and laughter spilling from its open windows. Under different circumstances, it would have seemed inviting and warm. Now, it represented my only hope of safety. I staggered toward the hall, burst through the doors, and collapsed against the nearest wall. The music stopped abruptly. Faces turned toward me, shocked, confused. I must have been quite a sight. Clothes torn, face scratched by branches covered in dirt, and trembling uncontrollably. "Fletcher, what in God's name happened to you?" It was Mr. Garrett, the foreman, who'd offered me a ride earlier. I tried to speak, but found I could barely form words. Something in the woods, following me, not human. Some of the younger men laughed nervously. One called out, "Looks like Fletcher started celebrating before he even got here." But Mr. Garrett wasn't laughing. Neither were some of the older loggers. They exchanged glances that I couldn't interpret at the time, but now recognize as knowing fear. "Get him some water," Garrett ordered. Two men helped me to a chair, while someone pressed a cup into my hands. The water revived me enough to give a more coherent account of what had happened. As I spoke, the laughter and dismissive comments faded. By the time I described the creature on the road and the calls in the forest, the room had fallen completely silent. When I finished, a heavy-set logger named Anderson stepped forward. 3 weeks ago, I was marking trees about 2 miles east of the main camp. Felt like something was watching me all day. On my way back, saw something big moving through the trees, upright, like a man but bigger, covered in dark hair. Another man, whose name I can't recall, added, "Found my equipment scattered all over last month. Thought it was bears, but there weren't any tracks. Just big footprints, like a man's but twice the size." More stories emerged. Missing tools, strange noises at night, shadows moving at the edges of the work sites, men refusing to work certain areas alone. Mr. Garrett finally raised his hands for silence. "Nobody walks back to camp tonight. We'll all stay here or at houses in the settlement. Tomorrow we go back in groups, armed." Someone near the back asked, "What do you think they are, Mr. Garrett?" The old foreman shook his head slowly. "The Indians who used to live in this valley had stories, called them wild men of the woods. Said they were here long before people came." That night, huddled in the dance hall with the other men, I couldn't sleep despite my exhaustion. Every sound from the surrounding forest made me flinch. I kept seeing those eyes in the twilight, that terrifying intelligence focused on me. The next day, a group of 15 men, all armed with rifles, escorted those of us from the lumber camp back along the road. We found nothing, no evidence of the creatures, no unusual tracks. Some of the men began to doubt my story, suggesting I'd been spooked by shadows and an overactive imagination. But over the next 2 weeks, strange things continued to happen. Tools disappeared from work sites. Men reported being watched. One night, several massive logs that had been carefully stacked were found scattered across a clearing, something that would have required enormous strength to accomplish. The final straw came when 2 men failed to return from a day of marking trees in the eastern section. A search party found them the next morning, physically unharmed, but in a state of near catatonic terror, unable to describe what had happened to them. 3 days later, the lumber company announced they were abandoning the site. They cited unstable ground conditions as the official reason, but everyone knew the truth. I left Washington that year, taking work in the shipyards in Seattle instead. I've never returned to the Cowlitz forests. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still see that creature on the road, still hear those calls echoing through the trees, still feel like I'm being watched. Most people don't believe me when I tell this story. That's fine. I don't need them to believe. I know what I saw. And sometimes, when reports of strange sightings in the Pacific Northwest forests make the newspapers, I wonder if others have encountered what I did. These wild men of the woods that were there long before us, and will likely remain long after we're gone. Story 12. I've never told this story publicly before now. For decades, I kept what happened to me that summer in 1924 to myself. Who would believe it? But I'm an old man now and I don't care anymore what people think. I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I want to get it down before I'm gone. I was prospecting up at Toba Inlet, north of Vancouver in British Columbia. Beautiful country, but remote as hell. I'd heard rumors about an old lost gold mine in the area, and I figured I'd try my luck while enjoying some solitude. I'd been working hard at the logging camps and needed a break, so this trip was part treasure hunt, part vacation. The trouble started on my third night at my base camp. I woke up to find my campsite had been disturbed. At first I thought it might be a bear, but things weren't torn apart like a bear would do. Items were missing, food mostly, but also my cooking pan and a bag of salt. What was strange was how selective the theft seemed. Whatever it was had carefully picked through my belongings. The next night, I secured everything better and slept with my rifle closer. Same thing happened. Woke up to find more food gone, and this time my backpack had been moved about 10 feet from where I'd left it. The zipper was neatly open, not torn. This wasn't normal animal behavior. By the fifth night, I was determined to catch whatever was raiding my camp. I prepared my sleeping bag with care, making it look like I was inside, but positioned myself nearby with my rifle across my lap and my prospecting pick within reach. I had a small cup of coffee to help me stay awake, but after hours of nothing happening, I must have dozed off despite my best intentions. I woke suddenly with that terrible feeling you get when something's not right. Before I could fully register what was happening, I felt my entire sleeping bag being lifted off the ground, with me inside it. I tried to shout, but the bag cinched tight around my face and I could barely breathe, let alone yell. My arms were pinned against my sides inside the bag, and my rifle was left behind, useless on the ground. The thing carrying me was walking fast. I could feel the swaying motion, the rhythm of heavy footsteps. I tried to struggle, but it was like being wrapped in a straitjacket. The bag was cinched so tight at the top that I couldn't see anything, and I was completely helpless. The journey seemed to go on forever. I estimate it lasted at least 3 hours, maybe 4. Whatever was carrying me moved quickly and seemed tireless. I felt us climbing steep inclines, fording streams, pushing through brush. Several times I nearly passed out from the combination of fear, disorientation, and lack of fresh air. All I could do was try to keep track of our direction by sensing the position of the morning sun through the fabric. Eventually, I felt myself being lowered to the ground. The top of the sleeping bag loosened, and I frantically pushed my way out, gasping for fresh air. My hand immediately went for my hunting knife, which thankfully was still on my belt. As I scrambled to my feet, what I saw made me freeze in place. Standing about 20 feet away were 4 creatures unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They looked like giant, hairy humans, but their proportions were all wrong. The largest one, clearly male, stood at least 8 feet tall with a distinctive hump on his back and massive shoulders. His forearms were extraordinarily long, hanging down almost to his knees. His face was flattened with a prominent brow, and I could see what looked like long canine teeth protruding from his mouth when he opened it. Next to him stood a female, shorter, at about 7 feet tall, but still massive. She had a more slender build, though I'd estimate she still weighed around 600 pounds. Her hair was longer, especially around her head, almost like a mane. The other 2 were younger, adolescents maybe. One was a young male, nearly as tall as the female, but lankier, probably around 7 feet with room to grow. The 4th was a younger female, shorter and more slightly built than the others, but still far larger than any human. All 4 were covered in dark reddish-brown hair, thicker on their shoulders and backs, sparser on their faces and fronts. Their skin, where visible on their faces, palms and soles, was a deep, leathery brown. They had feet like nothing I've ever seen. Not quite human, not quite ape, with a prominent big toe that seemed to jut out slightly to the side. I was in some kind of small valley or basin, surrounded by steep slopes on three sides. There was only one way out, a narrow gap between two rock faces, and the male Sasquatch positioned himself there immediately, as if he knew that would be my escape route. My first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. My second thought was to fight, but that was suicidal. The adult male alone looked like he could tear me apart without much effort. So I did the only thing I could do. I stayed put and observed. The creatures seemed curious about me, but not aggressive. They made no move to come closer after depositing me. The female and the younger ones kept their distance, while the male stood guard at the exit. They communicated with each other through a series of grunts, whistles, and what sounded almost like words, though nothing I could understand. As the shock began to wear off, I took stock of my surroundings. The basin was maybe 100 yards across at its widest, with a small stream running through it. There were plenty of berry bushes, ferns, and small trees. It looked like some kind of natural enclosure, or perhaps their home territory. Near one rock face was a crude shelter made of branches and brush. It wasn't sophisticated, just a lean-to structure large enough for the creatures to sit under. Around it were piles of plant material, berries, roots, and what looked like some kind of nuts or seeds. That first day, I kept as far from them as possible. I was terrified they would kill me, but they seemed content to watch me from a distance. The male would occasionally patrol the perimeter of the basin, always returning to guard the exit. The female gathered plants, stripping leaves and berries and placing them in organized piles. The younger ones seemed the most curious about me, occasionally venturing closer before being called back by a grunt from the female. Night was the hardest. I had no shelter except my sleeping bag, no fire, and no weapon except my knife. I positioned myself with my back against a rock face and tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually overcame me. When I woke the next morning, I was surprised to find myself alive and unharmed. The creatures had respected my space. Over the next few days, a routine developed. The adult male would leave early in the morning, sometimes returning with armfuls of a specific type of root or plant I didn't recognize. The female would sort through what he brought back, plus her own gatherings, creating neat piles of different food items. The youngsters would come and go, sometimes bringing back berries or other plants. I watched them eat, and it confirmed what I suspected. They were vegetarians. Their diet consisted entirely of plants, berries, roots, and some kind of tree bark that they seemed particularly fond of. They would carefully clean their food before eating, dunking berries in the stream or brushing dirt from roots. By the third day, hunger forced me to take some food from their piles when they weren't looking. They must have noticed, but they didn't object. In fact, the female later deliberately placed a pile of cleaned berries closer to where I was sitting, then backed away. It seemed like she was feeding me. I began to realize I wasn't a prisoner so much as a curiosity. They seemed fascinated by me, my clothes, my few possessions. The young male was particularly interested in my boots and would stare at them for long periods. The younger female liked the shiny buttons on my jacket and would mimic the motion of buttoning and unbuttoning when she thought I wasn't looking. Communication was impossible beyond basic gestures, but I started to recognize certain sounds they made. A specific grunt from the adult male that seemed to mean stay back or danger. A softer vocalization from the female when calling the younger ones. A series of fast clicks that preceded any group movement. On the fifth day, it rained. I huddled miserably under my sleeping bag, trying to stay dry. The Sasquatches seemed unbothered by the downpour, their thick hair shedding water easily. But that evening, the young female approached me cautiously and gestured repeatedly toward their shelter. After some hesitation, I followed her and found that the family had made space for me under their lean-to. We sat there, this impossible family and me, listening to the rain. It was surreal. That night, Something changed in how I viewed them. They weren't monsters or animals to me anymore. They were something in between, not human, but intelligent beings with their own society and behaviors. They cared for each other. They had enough awareness to recognize my discomfort in the rain and offer shelter, but I still wanted to escape. I needed to get back to my world. On the sixth day, I noticed the adult male watching me intently as I went through the few possessions I had left: my knife, a small compass, and a tin of snuff tobacco I carried. The tobacco especially caught his attention. His nostrils flared when I opened it, and he made a motion with his hand like he wanted to try it. That gave me an idea. The next morning, when he returned from his foraging, I deliberately took out the snuff tin and made a show of taking some. His curiosity was obvious. I held out the tin to him, gesturing for him to try some. After some hesitation, he took the tin and mimicked my actions, taking a huge pinch of snuff and inhaling it deeply into his nostrils. The effect was immediate and dramatic. His eyes widened, and he let out a thunderous sneeze that echoed through the basin, then another and another. Soon he was in a full-blown sneezing fit, dropping to his knees, disoriented and distressed. The other three rushed to him, concerned and distracted. This was my chance. I grabbed my sleeping bag, stuffed my few possessions into my pockets, and ran for the exit. I half expected to be chased, to feel those powerful hands grab me again, but the confusion bought me enough time. I squeezed through the gap and ran faster than I've ever run in my life, following the stream downhill, putting as much distance as I could between me and that basin. I ran until my lungs burned, then jogged until my legs gave out, then walked as fast as I could through the night. By dawn, I reached a logging road, and by midday, I encountered a survey crew who helped me back to civilization. I told them I'd gotten lost while prospecting, and they believed me. Who wouldn't? The truth was too fantastic. It took me 3 days to get back to Vancouver. I never told anyone the full story until now. Over the years, I've read accounts of Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings, and sometimes I recognize elements that match what I saw: the distinctive gait, the massive shoulders, the prominent brow. But none of the stories capture what I experienced, that these creatures aren't just undiscovered animals. They have intelligence, social structures, and something like compassion. I never went back to Toba Inlet, never went prospecting again. Some experiences change you forever, and my week with the Sasquatch family was such an experience. To this day, I sometimes dream about them, not as a nightmare, but as a memory of something extraordinary, something that exists in our world, but outside our understanding. I'm old now. The details of that week have never faded from my memory. The massive adult male with his long canines and hump, the careful, nurturing female, the curious youngsters, the simple shelter, the organized food piles, the way they communicated, the way they accepted me into their space. I know how this story sounds. I know most who read this will think it's fiction. That's why I kept silent all these years. But it happened. And somewhere in those remote forests of British Columbia, I believe they're still there. A family of giants living in quiet seclusion, occasionally curious enough about us to peek into our camps, or perhaps in very rare cases, to take one of us back home for a closer look. Story 13. I've never really told the full story of what happened that summer. It's been over 30 years now, but I still wake up in cold sweats some nights. My name is Fred Beck, and back in 1924, me and 4 other fellows experienced something that no man should ever have to face. We were prospectors, looking for gold in the mountains of Skamania County, Washington. There was me, Marion Smith, his brother Roy, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson. We'd heard rumors about rich deposits near Spirit Lake, in this deep canyon that cut through the wilderness. We were all experienced outdoorsmen, not the type to scare easy. We'd spent years in those mountains, knew how to handle ourselves against bears, mountain lions, whatever Mother Nature threw our way. We packed up our gear in early July and headed out, hiking deep into territory that felt almost untouched by man. It took us 3 days of hard trekking before we found the perfect spot to set up our base. It was about halfway up this steep canyon wall, gave us a good vantage point, close to the stream below where we planned to pan, but elevated enough to stay dry if the water rose. The canyon walls stretched up another couple 100 feet above us, all dense forest and rocky outcroppings. First thing we did was build ourselves a cabin. Nothing fancy, just a sturdy one-room structure with thick log walls, a door we reinforced with metal brackets, 2 small windows, and a roof strong enough to keep out the rain. We used the local timber, working from sunup to sundown. Took us about 5 days to finish it, but when we were done, we had ourselves a proper shelter. Inside, we set up our bunks, a small table, a wood stove, and kept our rifles mounted on pegs by the door. Everything seemed normal that first week. We were getting our bearings, mapping out the area, starting to pan in the stream. Found some promising color too, enough to keep our spirits high. The weather was good, game was plentiful, and we figured we'd struck a real sweet spot. No other prospectors for miles around. It was on our 8th day there when things started to get strange. I was coming back from checking some traps I'd set downriver when I noticed something odd in the soft mud near our water source. At first, I thought maybe a bear had come through, but when I got closer, I froze. There in the mud were footprints, human-like, but massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say they measured 19 inches from heel to toe. They were deep too, sunk a good 1.5 inches into the hard-packed earth, meaning whatever made them was heavy. I called the others over, and we all stood there staring at those prints. None of us said much at first. Marion suggested maybe it was some kind of prank, other prospectors messing with us. But we all knew there wasn't anyone else for miles. Besides, who would drag giant wooden feet all the way up here just to leave a few tracks? Maybe it's that wild man the Indians talk about, Gabe said. He'd spent some time with the local tribes and had heard stories about giant, hairy men who lived in the deepest parts of the mountains. We tried to laugh it off, but there was a tension in the camp that night that hadn't been there before. We all slept with our rifles a little closer. The next day we went on with our work, though we started staying closer together. 2 days passed without incident and we started to relax again, figuring whatever had made those tracks had moved on. Then around noon on the 3rd day after finding the tracks, Marion and Roy came stumbling back into camp, white as sheets. They'd been checking a possible dig site about half a mile upriver when they spotted it standing on a ridge about 100 yards away. It was looking right at us, Marion kept saying, his hands shaking as he poured himself a cup of coffee. 8 feet tall if it was an inch, covered head to toe in dark reddish-brown hair. Roy nodded. Had a face like a man but not a man, wide nose, deep-set eyes, and the smell, God, the smell when the wind shifted. Marion had raised his rifle and fired 5 shots at it, 3 to the head and 2 to the body. He swore he hit it square each time, but the thing just turned and disappeared into the thick forest. It didn't fall, Marion said, disbelief in his voice. I know I hit it. I know I did. We spent the rest of that day fortifying our cabin, added extra bracing to the door, covered the windows with wooden shutters that could be barred from the inside. We doubled our firewood supply and brought all our tools and equipment inside. All 5 of us agreed to sleep in shifts, 2 men awake at all times. The next morning I took first watch with Peterson. The others were catching some sleep after being up most of the night. It was a clear morning, cool with a light mist hanging over the canyon. I was standing outside the cabin, scanning the tree line with my binoculars, when I spotted movement about 200 yards down by the river. At first, all I could see was the brush moving. Then it stepped into a clearing, and my blood ran cold. It was just like Marion had described, impossibly tall, covered in thick hair, walking upright on 2 legs like a man. But there was nothing human about the way it moved. Too fluid, too powerful. I raised my rifle, took careful aim, and fired 3 shots in quick succession. The creature staggered, clutched at its chest, and then toppled over the edge of the embankment, falling into the river below. The current was strong that day, and I watched as it was swept downstream, disappearing around a bend. Peterson had come running at the sound of the shots, and we both stood there, staring at where the thing had fallen. "You got it," he said. "Maybe," I replied, but something told me it wasn't over. The others were awake now, and we told them what happened. We debated going down to the river to look for the body, but none of us was eager to separate from the group. Instead, we spent the day within sight of the cabin, working our claims but keeping our rifles at the ready. The day passed without further incident, but as dusk settled over the canyon, an unnatural quiet fell over the forest. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just a heavy silence that pressed in on us from all sides. We turned in early that night, with Marion and Gabe taking the first watch. I was exhausted from the stress and fell asleep quickly. I don't know how long I'd been out when the first thud shook the cabin. It was just after midnight. I jolted awake to find the others already on their feet, rifles in hand. There was a moment of silence, then another heavy thud as something slammed into the roof. "What the hell?" Roy whispered. We got our answer when a boulder the size of a man's head crashed onto our roof, the impact sending dust and debris raining down on us. Then another and another. "They're rolling rocks down on us," Peterson shouted as we braced ourselves against the walls. But it wasn't just rocks from above. Something began pounding on our door, not like a man knocking, but like a battering ram trying to break it down. The whole cabin shook with each impact. I moved to the window and carefully slid the shutter open just a crack. What I saw will haunt me till the day I die. In the pale moonlight, I could make out at least 5 of them, massive, hairy figures moving around our cabin. One was trying to force the door open with what looked like a thick tree branch. Others were scaling the canyon wall above us, dislodging rocks that tumbled down onto our roof. And the sounds they made, God, the sounds. It started as a low, guttural growling, but as the night wore on, it changed into this high-pitched wailing that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't animal, wasn't human. It was something else entirely. "Shoot!" Marion yelled, raising his rifle to one of the small gaps between the logs. We all opened fire, shooting through the walls at the shapes outside. The gunfire was deafening in the small cabin, and soon the air was thick with smoke. But we kept shooting, reloading, and shooting again. The attack paused briefly after our first volley of shots, and for a moment we thought they'd retreated. Then a massive, hairy arm punched through one of the shutters, grasping blindly inside. Peterson emptied his rifle into it, and the arm withdrew with a howl that shook the very ground. For 5 hours straight, they kept coming. Rocks crashed down on our roof without pause. The door creaked and splintered, but somehow held. Twice more, they tried to reach through the windows, and each time we drove them back with gunfire. "We're running out of ammunition," Gabe whispered around 3 in the morning. He was right, we'd brought plenty of shells for hunting, but not for a siege. "Just make them count," I said, rationing out our remaining bullets. By 4 a.m., the attack seemed to be weakening. The rocks came less frequently, the pounding on the walls more sporadic. The wailing had changed too, more angry than coordinated. Then, as the first grey light of dawn crept into the canyon, it stopped. Just stopped. The sudden silence was almost as terrifying as the attack had been. We didn't move for a long time, just stood there with our rifles trained on the door and windows, waiting. But nothing came. Peterson was the first to peer outside as full daylight washed over the canyon. "They're gone," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. We emerged from the cabin cautiously, rifles ready. The area around our cabin looked like a battlefield. Deep footprints were everywhere in the soft earth. Broken branches and scuff marks showed where they'd climbed the canyon walls. The ground was littered with our spent shell casings. Our roof had partially caved in from the barrage of rocks, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges, the wood splintered and gouged. None of us spoke much, as we gathered our essential gear. Without discussion, we knew we were leaving. 5 grown men who'd faced bears and mountain lions without blinking. All of us too terrified to spend another night in that canyon. We abandoned most of our equipment, taking only our rifles, some food, and our gold samples. The hike out felt like the longest journey of my life. Every snapping twig, every rustling bush sent us whirling around, weapons raised. But we saw nothing as we made our hard trek back to civilization. When we finally reached the nearest town, we went straight to the sheriff's office. I'll never forget the look on his face as we told our story, the mixture of disbelief and concern. But he must have seen something in our eyes, something that told him we weren't making this up, because he sent 2 deputies back with us to investigate. We led them to our abandoned cabin, which looked even worse in the clear light of day. The deputies found the same 19-inch footprints we'd seen, took measurements and made plaster casts. They documented the damage to our cabin and collected some tufts of coarse, reddish hair that had snagged on the splintered door. Word got out fast. Newspapers from Portland to Seattle ran the story. They started calling it Ape Canyon after our description of the creatures. Experts and curiosity seekers came to see the site. Most left as believers. Over the years, I've been called a liar, a drunk, a publicity seeker, but the 4 men who were with me that night know the truth. We've never wavered in our account, never changed a single detail. We know what we saw, what attacked us. I went back to prospecting eventually, but never in that area. Never alone either. I still camp, still hunt, but I always keep a fire going all night. And I never ever venture into deep canyons where the sun doesn't quite reach. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear their wailing again. And on sleepless nights, I wonder if they're still out there in those dark mountains, watching and waiting. I don't know what they were. Some kind of missing link, an unknown species, or something else entirely. All I know is what happened during those terrifying days at what's now called Ape Canyon. And though it's been 30 years, I still check the locks twice before going to bed, and I still wake up sometimes in the darkest hours, sure that I can hear rocks tumbling onto my roof. Story 14. I've debated whether to share this for years. Even typing this makes my hands shake a little. I'm not looking for people to believe me. Honestly, sometimes I wish I could convince myself it didn't happen, but it did, and I need to get it off my chest. Back in October 2010, I decided to take one last camping trip before winter hit. I've always been an outdoorsy guy, grew up hiking and camping around Washington State, and never had any problems heading out alone. The Okanogan Highlands have always been one of my favorite spots. Beautiful forests, not too many people, and you can really feel disconnected from everything. I picked a spot near an old fire lookout tower, about 14 miles from the nearest paved road. It was this perfect little meadow surrounded by thick pines and firs. I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed. No cell reception, no people, just me and nature for a couple days. The fall colors were amazing, all these reds and yellows against the deep green of the pines. Peaceful, you know. I got there around 3 in the afternoon. The drive up was rough. The Forest Service roads get pretty sketchy that late in the season, but my old Tacoma handled it fine. I parked at this little clearing about a mile from where I wanted to camp and hiked in with my gear. My campsite was this small flat area with a natural clearing, maybe 40 feet across. I set up my 2-person tent, built a fire pit with some rocks I gathered, and got a nice campfire going. Everything felt so normal. I collected firewood, heated up some chili I'd brought along, and just sat watching the flames while the sun started to set. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have this whole place to myself. That's when I first noticed something was off. The forest went silent. Like, completely silent. If you spend any time outdoors, you know forests are never quiet. There's always something. Birds, squirrels, the wind in the trees, something. But everything just stopped. No chirping, no rustling, nothing. It was like someone had hit mute on the entire forest. At first I didn't think much of it. Maybe a predator was passing through, cougar or something, and the animals were hiding. That happens. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy ones coming from behind my tent in the thickest part of the woods. Slow, deliberate steps crushing the fallen leaves and snapping twigs, way too heavy for a deer, too methodical for a bear. I'm not gonna lie, my heart started racing immediately. I stood up, turned toward the sound, and tried to act calm. "Hello?" I called out. "Someone there?" Nothing. Just silence. Then this sound that still gives me chills when I think about it. A long, slow exhale, like something big, letting out a breath it had been holding. It was maybe 30 yards away, hidden in the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. The beam only reached about halfway to where I thought it was coming from. I saw nothing but trees and shadows. I decided to add more wood to my fire, make it bigger, brighter. Don't ask me why, but I didn't pack up and leave right then. Part of me thought it might be another hiker, maybe someone messing with me. Part of me was just frozen in indecision. So I sat back down, kept my knife close, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. The sun completely set about an hour later. The night was clear, moonlit, and cold, maybe 40 degrees. I stayed by the fire as long as I could, but eventually had to crawl into my sleeping bag around 11. I left the fire burning low, thinking it might keep away whatever was out there. I didn't sleep, not really. I kept hearing things moving around outside, not constantly, but every 20 minutes or so, there would be footsteps circling my tent. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always taking the same path like it was patrolling. Around 1 in the morning, I heard a weird thumping sound. It was rhythmic, almost like something was beating on a log or a tree trunk. Thump, thump, thump. Then silence for a few minutes. Then it would start again. The worst moment came around 3 a.m. Something brushed against the side of my tent. The nylon fabric pushed in slightly, and I could hear sniffing, deep, powerful inhalations, like something was trying to catch my scent. I was frozen in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, not daring to breathe. It stayed there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, then moved away. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I just lay there, listening to whatever it was circling my camp, sometimes coming close, sometimes staying at the tree line. As soon as the first light hit, I unzipped my tent and stepped out. The morning was foggy and cold, with dew covering everything. My fire was completely out. That's when I saw them. Footprints, but not human footprints. They were enormous, easily 16 inches long and maybe 8 inches wide. They had 5 toes, clearly defined in the soft soil, and they sank at least 2 inches deep into the ground. I wear size 11 boots, and these things made my feet look like a child's. The prints formed a circle around my tent, just like the path I'd heard being walked all night. I followed them to where they led into the woods, but they disappeared once they hit this rocky patch of ground. I should have left right then. Any sane person would have. But I was curious. Terrified, but curious. I told myself it must have been a bear walking on its hind legs, even though I knew bears don't leave footprints like that. I told myself I'd just gather my things and leave after breakfast. So I made some instant coffee, ate a granola bar, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The day passed normally. I hiked around the area trying to distract myself. I considered leaving, but it was already afternoon, and I had this stubborn idea that whatever it was wouldn't come back. I convinced myself it was a one-time thing. As the sun started to set, I made dinner and built up my fire extra large. I set up a couple of battery-powered lanterns around my site too, creating a larger circle of light. Then, around 8 p.m., it started again, but different this time. I heard a howl from the ridge above my campsite. Not a wolf howl. I've heard those plenty of times. This was deeper, longer, almost like a person trying to imitate a wolf, but with a voice 3 octaves lower than humanly possible. It echoed across the valley, bouncing off the mountains. And then, the thing that really made my blood run cold, something answered it. From the valley below came another call, a series of whoops that rose and fell in pitch. Then another response from a different direction. There were at least 3 of them, calling to each other, and my campsite was right in the middle of their triangle. About an hour later, the rocks started. Small at first, pebbles and stones landing near my fire. They didn't come flying in. They just seemed to drop from above, like they were being lobbed in high arcs. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the trees, shouting, "Who's there? This isn't funny." No answer, just more rocks getting bigger. Then a fist-sized stone landed right next to my chair. I jumped up, heart pounding. That's when I saw it. At the edge of my light, maybe 40 feet away, standing half hidden behind a massive pine, was something. It was tall, way taller than me, and I'm 6'1", maybe 7 or 8 feet high. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and I could see its massive chest moving as it breathed. Its arms hung long at its sides, reaching almost to its knees. But it was the stillness that struck me most. It didn't rush at me. It didn't roar or make any sound. It just watched. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't make out its face clearly in the shadows. I backed toward my tent, never taking my eyes off it. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, partially hidden, watching me retreat. Once inside my tent, I zipped it up and lay there with my knife and flashlight, listening. I heard footsteps again, circling, but wider this time, staying just at the edge of the trees. The calls continued too, those deep howls and whooping sounds, back and forth all night. Something would occasionally throw another rock or branch. I'd hear them landing nearby. At one point, something heavy crashed through the underbrush right past my tent, not circling anymore, but charging straight through my campsite, fast and powerful. I thought it was going to run right over my tent, but it veered away at the last second. I didn't sleep. I don't think I even blinked. I just lay there, clutching my knife, waiting for dawn, convinced that if I fell asleep I wouldn't wake up. When morning finally came, I packed up in record time. I didn't even make coffee or breakfast. I just stuffed everything into my backpack, not caring how messy it was, and started hiking back to my truck as fast as I could move. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd spin around, sure I'd catch something following me, but I never saw anything. I heard branches breaking in the distance a few times, always off to my side, never directly behind me, like whatever it was pacing me through the woods. When I finally reached my truck, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove out of there doing about 30 miles an hour on roads where you should do 10, bottoming out my suspension multiple times, but not caring as long as I got away. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about those footprints and that silhouette watching me from the trees. I couldn't stop thinking about it. 3 weeks later, I convinced 2 friends to go back with me in daylight. I needed to prove to myself that there was a logical explanation. We hiked in, found my campsite easily enough, but there was nothing unusual there. No footprints, no signs of anything strange. The only weird thing was my fire pit. I'd left it as a circle of stones with ashes in the middle. Now it was filled with rocks, stacked in the center, almost like a cairn. My friends thought I was misremembering, but I know I didn't leave it that way. I haven't been back to the Okanagan Highlands since. I still go camping, but never alone, and never without a gun. I've researched everything I can find about the area and similar experiences. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others think it's some undiscovered species of great ape. All I know is what I experienced, and it wasn't human. Sometimes at night I still wake up thinking I hear that slow, heavy breathing outside my window, and every time I'm in the woods and the birds suddenly go quiet, I find myself frozen, listening for those deliberate footsteps coming through the brush behind me. Story 15. I've spent most of my life in the woods around the Yakima Reservation. My grandfather taught me to hunt before I could even properly shoulder a rifle, and those mountains have always felt more like home than anywhere else. I'm not the kind of person who gets spooked easily. 28 years in the same forests, you get to know every sound, every animal track, every way the wind moves through the trees. At least I thought I did. This happened back in November '94. The first snows were coming soon and I needed to get a deer in the freezer before winter really set in. I remember checking my gear the night before. My Winchester 36, extra shells, hunting knife, some jerky, water, the usual stuff. Nothing special about the preparation, nothing to suggest what was about to happen. I got up around 4 in the morning. The air was bitter cold, maybe 30 degrees, and there was heavy fog hanging over everything. I decided to try a spot in the Western Canyon area, about 15 miles from my place. It's rugged country out there, thick pine forests, steep ravines, lots of places where deer bed down when the weather turns. I'd had luck there before. I remember how quiet it was when I parked my old Ford at the logging spur. Usually there's something, wind in the trees, birds starting to wake up, something. But that morning, nothing. Just this heavy silence that seemed to swallow up even the sound of my boots on the fallen leaves. I should have paid more attention to that. Animals don't go quiet for no reason. The trail into the canyon is narrow, barely visible if you don't know it's there. I moved slowly, watching for signs, trying not to make noise. About half a mile in, I started noticing something wasn't right. First, there were broken branches overhead, snapped clean off at heights I couldn't reach even if I jumped. I'm 6'1", and these breaks were at least 10 feet up. I figured maybe a storm had done it, but the breaks looked fresh. The wood was still pale, not weathered. Then I saw the tracks. I've tracked every animal on this reservation. Deer, elk, bear, mountain lion, but these weren't anything I recognized. They were footprints, shaped like a human's, but massive, nearly 19 inches from heel to toe. 5 toes, clearly defined, with a wide arch and deep impression in the mud. Whatever made them was heavy as hell. The stride length was incredible too, measured about 5 feet between steps. No human walks like that. I crouched down to look closer, and that's when I felt it, that sensation of being watched that hits you right at the base of your skull, a tingling that runs down your spine. I stayed perfectly still, listening. That's when I heard it, this deep, chesty exhale, like someone letting out a breath they'd been holding for a long time. But it was loud, man, loud enough that I could tell whatever made it was big. My first instinct was to get to cover. I backed slowly toward a thicket of brush, keeping my movements deliberate. The forest was still dead silent. No birds, nothing. Then something moved through the trees ahead of me. At first, it was just a dark shape shifting between the trunks maybe 40 yards away. Then it stepped fully into view, and I swear my heart stopped for a second. I've never believed those stories the elders tell about the hairy giants in the woods. Always thought they were just meant to scare kids away from wandering too far. But there it was. It was tall, at least 8 feet, probably more, covered in this matted reddish-brown hair that hung in clumps, not like a bear's fur at all, longer, more human-looking somehow. Its shoulders were unbelievably broad, had to be at least 3 feet across. What really got me were the arms. They hung down past its waist, with hands that looked almost too big for its body. It walked upright, but with a slight hunch, kind of swinging its arms with each step. Its head looked wrong, sat low between those massive shoulders, with almost no neck, and had this sloped forehead and flat face. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just stood there clutching my rifle while this thing stopped about 30 yards away. It turned its head toward me, and I saw its nostrils flare as it sniffed the air. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, deeper than that. It wasn't aggressive exactly, but I felt it in my chest, like standing too close to a speaker at a concert. When it took a step in my direction, I stumbled back. My rifle came up automatically, but I wasn't even aiming. My hands were shaking too bad. The thing tilted its head, studying me. Then it made this sudden lunging movement sideways, not toward me, but it hit a small tree with its shoulder. The tree was maybe 4 inches thick, and it snapped like it was nothing. Just broke clean through. That was enough for me. I turned and ran, didn't think about it, just ran. Crashing through brush, jumping over fallen logs, my lungs burning from the cold air. Behind me, I could hear branches breaking, heavy footfalls. It was following me. Not charging, not gaining ground rapidly, but keeping pace, like it was escorting me out. I don't remember much about reaching the logging road, just that my legs were on fire, and I could taste blood in the back of my throat from breathing so hard. I threw my gear into the truck, fumbled with the keys, and peeled out of there. The whole drive home, I kept checking the rearview mirror. For 3 days, I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? That I saw the thing from the old stories? Nobody would believe me. I barely believed myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks. They were real. I'd seen them with my own eyes, touched the impressions with my fingers. Finally, I called my buddy Joe. We've known each other since grade school, hunted together hundreds of times. If there was anyone who wouldn't laugh me off the reservation, it was him. I didn't tell him everything, just said I'd found some strange tracks and wanted his opinion. We went back on Friday. The whole drive there, my stomach was in knots. Part of me hoped the tracks would be gone, washed away by rain or just a figment of my imagination, but they were still there. Joe saw them and went quiet. He's usually got something to say about everything, but he just stared at those prints for a long time. "Ray," he finally said, "what the hell made these?" I told him I didn't know, which wasn't entirely true. I just couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. We followed the tracks for almost half a mile. They led deeper into the canyon, across a small creek, then up a ridge. The terrain got steeper, with loose shale that made climbing difficult. The tracks disappeared at the edge of a drop-off that fell maybe 70 feet into a ravine below. That's where we found the deer, or what was left of it. It was a young buck, probably 2 years old. Its limbs were torn off. Not cut, torn. The ribs were snapped open like someone had pulled them apart from the center. But there were no bite marks, no signs that any predator had been feeding on it. Just this destroyed carcass that looked like it had been pulled apart by something incredibly strong. Joe wouldn't say much after that. We gathered some pine branches and covered the deer as best we could. An old habit, showing respect. The walk back to the truck was tense. Both of us kept looking over our shoulders, scanning the trees. "My grandfather used to talk about them," Joe finally said as we reached the logging road. "Said they've always been here. Said they don't like being seen." I didn't hunt at all that winter. Told everyone I had a bad back. By spring, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But I've never gone back to that canyon, and I don't hunt alone anymore. There's something else too. Sometimes at night, especially when the wind is blowing from the west, I swear I can hear something moving around outside my house. Heavy footsteps circling the property. My dogs won't go out when it happens, just huddle by the wood stove and whine. Last summer, I found tracks again, right at the edge of my property where the forest starts. Same size, same shape, and beside them, a half-eaten elk haunch left there like, I don't know, like an offering. I've started listening more closely when the elders speak about the old stories. I don't laugh anymore when they talk about the beings that live in the deep woods. They say these creatures have been here since the beginning, that they watch over the land, that they only show themselves when they choose to. They say seeing one can be a message, a warning or a blessing, depending on how you receive it. I don't know what to make of all this. I just know what I saw that day wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a suit, wasn't anything I can explain. It was real, solid, breathing. It could have caught me if it wanted to, I'm certain of that, but it didn't. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. Then I remember the sound it made, that deep rumbling growl that I felt more than heard. I remember the way it moved, fluid and powerful despite its size. I remember the intelligence in the way it studied me, The deliberate way it broke that tree, like it was sending a message. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods, but I'm more careful now, more respectful. I leave small offerings sometimes, bits of food, tobacco. The elders would understand why. There are things in these mountains older than our stories about them, things that don't fit into the world as we understand it. I know because I've seen one. And sometimes on cold nights when the wind is still and the moon is hidden, I wonder if it's still out there, if it remembers me, if our paths will cross again. All I know for sure is that the woods don't feel the same anymore. They're deeper somehow, more mysterious. And I'm not the only one around here with stories like mine. I'm just one of the few willing to talk about it. Most people keep these things to themselves, afraid of being laughed at or called crazy. But I know what I saw, and I know I'm not crazy. That thing was real as the ground under my feet, as real as the scars on my hands, as real as the fear I still feel when I think about those moments in the canyon. I just hope I never see it again. Or if I do, that it remembers I meant it no harm, because I don't think I'd be lucky enough to just be escorted out of its territory a second time.